Today, we're going to look at one of the most unbelievable revenge stories I've ever come across, but you won't even know that it's a revenge story until the very end. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is out of town, secretly bug their house with cameras and microphones, and then live stream those feeds on the billboards in Times Square, New York. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early evening of May 7th, 2008, a 65-year-old woman named Zivana Temolkoska walked around her kitchen inside of her apartment in the little southeastern European city of Kisevo. Kisevo is a quiet place at the base of this huge mountain in northern Macedonia, and while it's totally beautiful, it's utterly remote, and basically nothing really of note happens here. Zivana cleaned houses for a living, but on this particular day, she was on a day off, and so she was just kind of hanging out at her apartment, waiting for her adult son, named Zoran, to come home. It was a beautiful, warm evening that night, and so Zivana had the windows in the kitchen open as she walked around making herself something to eat, and at some point, as she was doing this, she heard her phone ring, and so she grabbed it and answered, and she heard the sound of her friend on the other line. But her friend's voice sounded strange. It was strained and very uncomfortable, and she was asking Zivana if she was paying attention to the news right now. Did she have the radio on or the TV? And Zivana was like, no, why? And the friend would tell her that all over the news right now, there was this huge, terrible traffic accident that had happened in their town, and unfortunately, Zivana's son, Zoran, who she was waiting for to come home, was apparently involved in this accident. Zivana let out a strangled cry when she heard this, and then just dropped what she was using to make food and turned and ran out the door. And when she did, her neighbor who was outside saw her emerge and yelled out to her, hey, is everything okay? And Zivana, as she literally just continued running towards the road, she basically blurted out to the neighbor that her son was hurt and she was going to the hospital. And this neighbor watched as Zivana just ran down the road, turned the corner, and disappeared. Zivana did not have a car of her own, and so literally she was going to run to the hospital to make sure her son was okay. A little while later, that same neighbor who had just watched Zivana disappear around the corner heard a knock on their door. And so the neighbor went to the door, they opened it up, and they were totally shocked at who they saw standing outside. It was Zivana's son, Zoran, who did not appear to be hurt in any way. But before the neighbor could ask any questions about this, Zoran, who looked visibly confused, said to the neighbor, hey, have you seen my mom? We were supposed to meet and have dinner together, and it's just totally unlike her to disappear without telling me where she was going. The neighbor just stared at Zoran for a second, having no idea what was going on here, and then the neighbor was like, well, wait a minute, Zoran, were you in a car accident? And Zoran's like, no, what are you talking about? And then the neighbor kind of filled Zoran in about how they had seen his mother run outside, and she had mentioned how her son had been in this car accident, and she literally ran to the hospital. Zoran was just as mystified by this as the neighbor was, and so Zoran just grabbed his phone and called the hospital to see if his mother was there. But when the hospital picked up, they would tell Zoran that his mother was not there, she had not been there all day, and two, even though they had heard reports about this car accident in town, there had not been any car accident victims brought to the hospital at all that day. And so by the end of that night, when Zoran really had no idea what had happened to his mom, where she was, or what was going on with this car accident thing, he just did the only thing he could think to do, which was go to the police and report his mother missing. 9 days later, on May 16th, when still Zivana was missing and the police had no idea what happened to her, there were no new leads, nothing, on this day, a 56-year-old reporter named Vlado Teneski, who actually happened to live not that far away from where Zivana lived, he got a call from one of his police sources. And the source would tell him that Zivana had actually just been found, even though this was not public information, and unfortunately, Zivana was dead. Her body, which had been beaten and strangled and stabbed, had been found wrapped up in plastic and dumped in this illegal dumping area not far from the town's football stadium. The source told Vlado that when her body was searched, they discovered she still had valuables on her person, and so that kind of ruled out the possibility that this was a robbery gone wrong, which was the initial theory about what they were seeing. However, when police had done an initial probe into Zavana's life to figure out who this victim was, they discovered that she was just this poor old cleaning lady who had no enemies to speak of, and so it really just made no sense that she was the victim of such an obviously brutal and intimate murder that was not financially motivated, at least not on the surface. Vlado thanked his source for all the information and then hung up. Vlado's source had sounded really shocked by this murder as he was telling Vlado, but now, as Vlado was sitting here thinking about what he had just been told, he wasn't really shocked as much as he was suspicious. He felt like something just was off about this murder. Maybe Zavana appeared to be this poor old cleaning lady with no enemies, but in reality, maybe that wasn't who she was. Maybe she was leading a secret life that got her killed. Or maybe she had stumbled upon something she was not supposed to see and that got her killed. Vlado had no idea, but he just felt like, there's something off about this and it needs to be investigated. Now, Vlado had a reputation in town for being this very aggressive and kind of fearless journalist who had no problem diving headfirst into some of these really murky stories that could involve corruption or misuse of power, and he would get to the bottom of it, and he would publish these articles where he spoke really critically about the government, about police, about anybody really who was in a position of power. But as a result of conducting himself this way, over his 30-year career, Vlado had been threatened with violence many, many times for things he had written or things he was about to write. But even though Vlado knew this Zavana murder case had the potential to once again put him in hot water with the powers that be, he still felt like it was his responsibility to dive into this thing and get to the truth. So, feeling determined, Vlado grabbed his notebook and pen, and he walked out the front door of his house, and he made the several-minute-long walk over to Zavana's house. And when he got there, her son, Zoran, opened the door, and a few minutes later, Vlado and Zoran were sitting in the kitchen talking about what had happened. Zoran told Vlado all about how he came home and discovered his mom wasn't there, and then he went to the neighbor's house, and they explained how, they had seen Zavana running off to the hospital to go look for Zoran, but Zoran's like, I'm not hurt, I didn't get into a car accident, what's going on here? And as Zoran spoke, Vlado took lots of notes and asked lots of follow-up questions, and by the end of this interview, when Vlado felt like he knew everything there was to know about Zavana, he felt like he actually had a pretty good working theory as to what actually happened to Zavana. And the reason he felt like his theory could be accurate had to do with what Zoran told Vlado his mother did for a living, that she was a cleaning lady. Now, it took Vlado a couple of days to put together his story. He had to go out and interview dozens more people in the neighborhood. But finally, on May 19th, so just 3 days after Zavana was found murdered, Vlado published a story in the newspaper. And the story's explosive headline read, "A Serial Killer Stalks Kosovo." Did you know that this YouTube channel is not the only place where we post strange, dark, and mysterious content? No, we also have the MrBallen's podcast, which has over 180 episodes, all strange, dark, and mysterious, that are available to listen to right now on Amazon Music. And at least half of them are completely exclusive to the podcast, which means you cannot get those stories unless you listen on the podcast. But that's not all. In addition to the MrBallen's podcast, we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries podcast, which, you guessed it, covers medical mysteries. They're all strange, dark, and mysterious, but medical is the focus. And that podcast is available on all podcast platforms, but if you listen on Amazon Music, you can get batches of 8 episodes that get released in seasons. On all other podcast platforms, it's 1 episode a week, but Amazon Music, it's like a binge. So again, in addition to this YouTube channel, there are 2 other places, MrBallen's podcast and MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where you can find more new, original, strange, dark, and mysterious content. Go check them out. In the story, Vlado says that Zavana's murder was very likely not an isolated killing. Instead, her murder was likely linked to 2 other murders of 2 other women. And these 2 other victims looked an awful lot like Savannah, literally. They were poor, older women who were also cleaning ladies. And so that was why when Vlado was talking to Zoran, and Zoran described how his mother was, what she did for work, what she looked like, that Vlado started to remember these other victims, and he put it all together. The other 2 victims were 64-year-old Mitra Simjanoska, who was murdered in 2005, and the other victim was 56-year-old Lubitsa Lukoska, who was murdered in 2007. Now, Vlado's story was totally explosive because what he's saying is that there is a serial killer that is on the loose in this town. But this story was also highly explosive because Vlado spoke very critically about the police who were involved in this investigation. Specifically, he pointed out that the 05 and 07 murders of those 2 other women, those had been totally mishandled because arrests had been made in at least one of those cases, and clearly whoever they arrested was innocent here. And so the police just totally dropped the ball, at least in Vlado's opinion. And when the police read Vlado's story, they were very upset at him because he was so critical of them. However, the police also did see that Vlado had managed to uncover a lot of new details from all of his interviews with witnesses and people in the neighborhood that did seem to paint a picture of this potentially really being a serial killer, not individual isolated killings. And so the police, based on Vlado's story, would actually begin investigating a serial killer in their midst. They linked all 3 murders and they began basically a new investigation. However, at the same time they began this new investigation, Vlado began to notice that he was being tailed all the time by police. He would be out in town doing his job, reporting and interviewing people, and there'd just be a police officer standing somewhere in the distance watching him. But Vlado had anticipated that no matter what, he was likely going to face some sort of blowback from the police, and so he just kind of accepted that they were going to watch him and maybe try to intimidate him, but it wasn't going to bother him because he had done his job, he had reported the story the best that he could, and if they wanted to watch him from a distance, they could do that. By early June, so about 2 weeks after Savannah had been found murdered, the police, in this new serial killer investigation they were doing, had narrowed down their suspect pool, which was in the hundreds, down to just 3 people, and they felt like they were very close to making an arrest. About a month later, on June 20th, so by this point Vlado is still being trailed by police all the time, but the police have not come out publicly and said anything about the serial killer case. They're just continuing their investigation. But on this day, June 20th, Vlado's editor at the newspaper got a call from a police officer telling the editor they were about to make an arrest in the serial killer case. And as soon as their conversation ended, the editor called Vlado to tell him the news. But when he called Vlado, Vlado didn't pick up, which was very unusual. Vlado always answered his calls. And the editor was also thinking to himself how strange it was that this officer had contacted him and not Vlado. Like, why aren't you going to the guy writing the stories and telling him about this new development? Why are you coming to me? The editor would continue to try calling Vlado several more times, but Vlado never answered. And so ultimately, the editor just kind of assumed that Vlado must be busy, interviewing someone, or maybe more likely, he had already learned about this imminent arrest, and he was on scene, ready to capture in real time this arrest that was about to take place. Meanwhile, on a quiet street in Kosovo, the police had surrounded this very modest 2-story home that was very overgrown up front. It was surrounded by tall fir trees, and all the windows had heavy drapes covering them up. And then once the police felt like they had totally surrounded this building, a team of officers walked up onto the porch and knocked on the door and yelled out that they were police and whoever was inside to come out with their hands up. And for a moment, it was just totally silent and tense. And then the police on the porch heard footsteps inside the house. They had their guns ready to go, and then the door slowly opened up, and this man, who seemed very unthreatening and kind of confused, stepped out onto the porch, and the police immediately arrested him and took him away. A few minutes later, back at the newspaper headquarters, Vlado's editor got another phone call. And when he answered, it was the same police officer who had called before to warn him about this upcoming arrest. Except this time, the officer was calling to say the arrest had been made, they had caught their serial killer, and then he told the editor the name of the person they arrested. And when the editor heard the name, he dropped the phone in shock. The serial killer was Vlado. It would turn out that Vlado appeared very professional and calm on the outside, but inside, he was full of rage, specifically at his mother, who he viewed as this terrible, cruel person. And after she died in 2002, Vlado became obsessed with this idea of getting revenge on his deceased mother. And the way he decided he would do that would be by killing random women who just kind of looked and seemed an awful lot like his mother, i.e., they were poor, older, and cleaning ladies. His 3 victims, Mitra in 2005, Lubitsa in 2007, and Zvana in 2008, had all personally known Vlado's mother. And so Vlado had actually used that connection to gain each of his victims' trust, and then once he had their trust, he would lure them away to strangle, stab, and beat them to death. In Vlado's explosive newspaper story, he lied about a whole bunch of things just to throw the police off. Like, for example, he made up that he spoke to a witness who claimed to have seen Zvana get into a car with 2 men right before she vanished. Vlado did not see that. That was just a total lie designed to confuse the police. Vlado had also been the one to plant that story on the radio about Zvana's son, Zoran, being in this terrible accident. That had caused Zvana to run out of her house and be vulnerable to be scooped up and killed, which is exactly what Vlado wanted. He had called the radio station and told them about this accident, and because he had previously worked for that radio station, they believed him without doing any fact-checking and broadcast the story. And so really that whole radio broadcast was just a very intentional trap by Vlado to kill Zvana. But what ultimately got Vlado caught was in the article he wrote, he left in some really specific details that the police had not revealed to the public. And so basically by including these in the story, it meant Vlado had an inside scoop into what was really going on. Like, for example, Vlado said that all 3 of these women who had been killed by the serial killer had been strangled to death by telephone cords that were left at the scene. But again, the police had not revealed that to the public, and so when they read the story, they actually became very suspicious of Vlado and thought he could be involved in these murders. And so when Vlado felt like the police were trailing him just to intimidate him, in reality, the police were trailing Vlado because they thought he could be the murderer, and eventually, when they got a DNA sample from Vlado, it was confirmed that their suspicions were right. He was the killer. After Vlado's arrest, he was immediately charged with 2 of the 3 murders, and the police were getting ready to charge him with the 3rd, and they were even looking at a 4th victim, potentially, that maybe Vlado had killed as well, but they weren't entirely sure yet. But on June 23rd, so just 3 days after Vlado's arrest, he died in jail in a way that really didn't make any sense. Vlado had drowned in a small bucket of water inside of his jail cell while there were 3 other people inside of that jail cell with him who all said they didn't notice it happening. Officially, Vlado's death was ruled a suicide, and after his death, all of the murder investigations were closed. It's no secret that many of the stories I cover involve people attacking other people or even killing other people, and I just need you to know that I do not take that lightly. The people in these stories are real. They had real families and friends. They had jobs, careers, ambitions, goals, good days, bad days. I mean, they were just like us. But unfortunately, the way the media often portrays violent crime is the focus of the news coverage is on the perpetrator or perpetrators and not on the actual victim or victims or their families. When the news coverage fades about the crime, the victim and their families are just kind of forgotten about, until now. The MrBallen's Foundation, which was founded in 2022, exists solely to honor and support victims of violent crime as well as their families. And because the operational expenses of the MrBallen's Foundation are funded entirely by Ballen's Studios, it means charitable donations that come into the foundation go 100% to the cause. Not 99%, not 98%, 100%. Your money that comes in, it goes right out the door to the cause. And this year, in 2023 alone, with your help, we raised $763,420. And that money was given directly to victims of violent crime, as well as their families. And also portions of that money were also given to reputable, established charitable organizations that are out there right now, making a real difference for these forgotten people that we're trying to help. If you want to get involved, involved, go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on the tab at the top of the screen that says Get Involved. Most people join the Honor Them Society, which you can learn about on the Get Involved tab, because in addition to supporting the cause, that tier of giving also affords you perks like exclusive access to special live events with me. So again, the website is MrBallen.Foundation and just click on Get Involved. Thank you so much to all of our donors, our supporters, and of course the fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. Without all of you, none of this would be possible. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the Mr. Ballen Podcast, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, but many of them are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the Mr. Ballen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Today, I'm going to tell you 3 incredible stories about real people who had something totally unexpected and insane happen to them that not only, completely changed their lives, but in some of these cases, it completely changed other people's lives as well. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, on the next really hot summer day, offer to make the like button a nice fresh cup of lemonade. But don't tell them you used salt instead of sugar. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One afternoon in the early 2000s, a young woman named Rose drove up to this huge mansion in the Hollywood Hills in California. She came to a stop outside the fence, and she just sat there for a minute feeling very nervous because what she was about to do was highly illegal. So Rose was a musician, but she definitely had not made it yet. However, she was desperately trying to break into the industry. And so her big plan today was she was going to sneak in to this mansion, which was home to arguably one of the most famous people on the planet, a big-time musician. And her plan was to give them a copy of her demo CD, because she believed if they would just listen to just one song on there, they would be blown away by her talent and they would help usher her into the industry and her career would take off. Now, obviously she knew this could go horribly wrong and, the owner of this home could just as easily call the police and have her thrown in jail, but to her, it felt like the risk was worth it. And so Rose got out of her car and she looked up this huge driveway that extended up this hill, and it reached this big gate that sort of blocked off the driveway about halfway up. And then the driveway beyond the gate continued up to the mansion. And from where she was standing, there really was nobody out on the property anywhere. It was totally quiet, just this massive mansion up on a hill. But in front of the gate, on her side of the gate, was clearly the gardener. And, at first she thought maybe, the gardener was going to be a problem, that of course they would see her if she tried to break into the property. But, Rose was desperate and she thought the gardener looked friendly enough. And so she decided she would go up and maybe try to convince the gardener to let her go through the gate. And so she took a deep breath, and with her demo CD in hand, Rose began walking up this first stretch of driveway. And as she got closer to the gate, the gardener stopped what they were doing and turned to kind of see what this person was doing. And, Rose was very young and charismatic, and she seemed friendly enough. And she comes walking up the driveway, and she approaches the gardener and pulls out a $5 bill and hands it to the gardener and just says, "Look, I got no money. This is my last $5. Please, will you let me go through? I just want to drop something off." And so the gardener takes the $5 and just smiles at Rose and says, "Okay, go ahead." After all, Rose is like a kid. She seems completely harmless. What's the worst that could happen? And so Rose is kind of blown away that the gardener is actually letting this happen, but she doesn't wait. She just goes right past the gardener, slips through the front gate, and starts walking right up towards the mansion. And as Rose is walking up this driveway towards the front door of this gargantuan piece of property, she's looking around at the beautiful landscaping and just how valuable and beautiful everything looked. And she's seeing all these cameras pointing in every direction. And she's just waiting for any minute, security guards to come running out here and tackle her to the ground. But nothing happened. She walked right up to this huge, beautiful front door. And again, no one's come to meet her. And so she just knocks on the front door, but nobody comes to the door. So she's thinking, what do I do? Like, I've come this far. I really want to hand this demo CD off. And so almost like without even thinking, she just reached down and tried the doorknob, thinking, of course it's going to be locked. But no, it was open. And so she turns the doorknob and pushes the door in. And now she's looking into the home of, again, one of the most famous people on the planet, and nobody's stopping her. At this point, Rose didn't even know what to make of the situation she found herself in. I mean, she had been fantasizing about how this was going to go for weeks leading up to this, and it didn't involve it being this easy and straightforward. But here she was, and so again, without hesitation, she just walked inside this home. And as she's looking around, I mean, everything is beautiful and everything is clearly so expensive. There's all this amazing artwork and fancy furniture. There's billiard halls, there's wine cellars. I mean, this is a gorgeous property, exactly what you'd expect for the person who lives here. And as she's kind of snooping around the first floor, looking for the owner, she's amazed to see that it's like nobody's home. It's just this vacant, unbelievable mansion. Eventually, she walks around and finds there's an elevator. And so she's like, all right, I'll just get in the elevator and go up. And so she gets in this beautiful elevator, she shuts the door, she hits the button to go to the next floor. And as the car begins to move, she realizes like this is gonna make some noise, like someone's gonna hear me, like, oh my gosh, now I'm gonna get caught. And so she starts to freak out. And so she pulls out her big clunky Nokia cell phone and she calls her mom. And when her mom picks up, she tells her that, you know what, almost certainly I'm about to get arrested here. And as her mom is like, what are you doing? What is going on here? The elevator that Rose is in came to a stop and the door opened up. And as soon as Rose saw what was in front of her, she just lowered the phone, her mom's still talking into it, and just stared. It was like she was totally struck by what she was seeing. Because right in front of her, in the room right outside of this elevator, is the person who owns this house, the extremely famous major celebrity who's just sitting there with a guitar, strumming along, just minding his own business. And he turns and looks at Rose, and Rose is looking at him, and there's this moment of just stunned silence, like neither of them can really figure out how this even came to be. Now at this point, Rose knew it was her chance. And so even though she's unbelievably starstruck and scared and has no idea what's about to happen, she just quickly walks a little bit forward into the room and throws her demo CD onto this table that was sort of between the two of them. And this big time musician is just like, again, standing there staring at her like, what are you doing here? And after Rose did that, she didn't say anything. She just turned, headed back to the elevator and began to make her escape. But by the time she made it back to the front door, this big time musician's security team did catch up to her and they stopped her. However, they did decide not to call the police. And so Rose was very lucky that she escaped without a criminal record, which is sort of incredible when you consider the home she actually broke into. This was the home of Prince. Again, arguably at the time, one of the most famous people in the world. I mean, it's bad enough sneaking into anybody's home, but this is like egregious. So the idea that she got right up next to Prince and gave him her demo CD without consequence, pretty incredible. But despite all this, her interaction with Prince really didn't have any bearing on her career. He didn't care at all about her demo CD. He did not, throw her name out to industry contacts and, blow her career up. Basically, he said, I won't press charges, now get out of here. That was it. However, Rose did go on to become an incredibly famous musician in her own right. She just did it without the help of Prince. Today, Rose's tracks go multi-platinum, and she's sold more than 100 million copies of her records. Rose is actually her middle name. You very likely know her by her stage name, which is also her actual first name, and that is Kesha. Last year, we launched a brand new podcast here at Ballin Studios called Redacted, Declassified Mysteries with Luke LaManna. And so far, you guys have loved it. And in case you haven't heard, we also launched a YouTube channel for Redacted, where you can not only listen to these episodes, but also watch the beautiful animations we've done for each of these episodes. That channel already has 150,000 subscribers, and it's growing really quickly, and there are hours of content available right now for you to binge. New uploads to this YouTube channel will be every single Tuesday. All you have to do is look up @Redacted Mysteries on YouTube, and I'll also be putting a link in the description below. Wondery Plus subscribers can also watch Redacted on the Wondery app. Okay, back to the stories. One day in 2008, a 50-year-old man named Carlo was at his home in Connecticut reviewing all this financial documentation. So Carlo had filed for bankruptcy a few years earlier, and it had proven to be very complicated. And there was all this paperwork he was still getting, and his bankruptcy case had not even finalized yet. And so what he thought would be sort of like a quick fix to a huge problem had turned into a really complicated mess. And now he had even more paperwork to sign. I mean, it was totally overwhelming. So Carlo was an actor, and in many ways, he had had lots of success. He had been on Broadway, he had starred in shows and movies, like he was a respected actor with lots of contacts in the industry. But despite that, he hadn't really ever made it. Like he couldn't really consistently land high-paying or even consistent work, period. And so despite his reputation as being a very talented actor, it really wasn't translating to financial success. Now, this situation that Carlo was in would not have been that bad if he was single, but he wasn't. He was married with 4 children to take care of. And on top of that, Carlo also felt this really intense pressure that was sort of maybe felt in the industry in general, in the sort of entertainment industry, to keep up with his appearances. As much as he was struggling financially, he felt like he didn't want his peers to know that that might eat into his ability to get big roles. And so he's got all this pressure to take care of his family and all this pressure to maintain this idea that he's really successful and doing great. But in reality, he just felt like a total fraud. He had no money, and he felt like he didn't even know how he was going to dig himself out again. And so as Carlo is sitting there staring at this mountain of paperwork, he started to have this very dark thought that had sort of crept into his mind a couple of times over the past few months, as this huge issue just continued to get bigger and bigger. But now, this dark idea had become fully realized in his mind. He began to think, maybe if I were to die, there could be a large insurance payout to my family. That would solve their financial problems, and it would also sort of, abscond me from looking like the fraud that I really am. Nobody would know. I'd be dead. They wouldn't know that I had all these issues. I'd just, be gone, and people would miss me and my family. They'd be financially taken care of. Maybe that's a possibility. Obviously Carlo was not trying to end his life because he didn't want to be here anymore. He just felt like he did not have another way out. And so he actually went to his wife and began sort of, nonchalantly asking her questions about their, various insurance plans to see if he had a good life insurance policy that would pay out if he were to go. And eventually he got his wife to tell him that, yeah, you have a very generous life insurance policy. We are good if, the worst were to happen and something were to happen to you. And at that point, Carlo felt like, that's it. That's the way to fix this problem. I need to die. However, when Carlo actually did begin researching this route, seeing exactly how, an insurance payout would work if he were to take his own life, he quickly learned that, payouts after a suicide on these life insurance plans are very complicated. And there's all these stipulations involved because, insurance companies do not want people taking their own life in order to get these payouts. And so Carlo was quickly seeing that if he were to take his life, it would not be like, okay, quick payout to his family. Quite the opposite. And in some cases, his family might not even be entitled to this payout. And so Carlo's thinking, well, okay, I can't take my own life. I need to find another way to have my life come to an end. And so he's thinking, okay, I'll start picking up really dangerous hobbies, and maybe I can sort of die by accident. Maybe I'll start hang gliding and fall out of my harness, and that'll be the way I die. And maybe that'll lead to a payout. Or I'll start doing base jumping, or all these different things that might reasonably explain why he suddenly died. But he also was thinking, people would see through that. I'm not the type of guy that picks up really dangerous hobbies, and so that could be kind of suspicious. He's like, okay, well, what else could I do? And he's like, oh, I could hire a hitman. Somebody else will kill me. And then, that's not my fault. Somebody else took my life. That'll allow for a payout, right? But, the more he thought about it, the more that too seemed highly suspicious. I mean, people don't usually get away with hired hits. And so several months go by, and Carlo is still alive, because he's basically discovered that there really isn't a way to intentionally end his life, directly or indirectly, without getting caught and sort of jeopardizing the one thing he wants this to do, which is to have this payout for his family. And so he's just sort of stuck in this situation that he does not feel like he can get out of. Like, he's just completely buried by debt and this general financial crisis he's in. And so Carlo was doing really the only thing he knew he could do, which is just to get out there and audition for as many shows and movies and various acting opportunities as he possibly could to at least, get some amount of money coming in, even though clearly it was still never going to be be enough. But in late 2008, Carlo got an interesting call from his agent who worked to get him some of these roles. Now, Carlo's agent, who did understand Carlo was in dire straits here, quickly explained to Carlo that, this role didn't really pay much, but, you'd be able to be a part of a very big show. I mean, yeah, your role is sort of minimal, but this is huge. It's a big credit, and, maybe it lends itself to you getting other work. This could be a great opportunity for you. Now, Carlo had heard his agent sort of pitch him on various roles and the opportunity and all that before, and so he was grateful to be, told this is a good opportunity, but he was sort of skeptical. But he received the script, and he began reading about, what his character would be doing in the show. And he quickly realized that, this role actually might be more perfect for me than even the producers and directors might realize. So this role was for this particular character on the show who sort of, in the show, hides in plain sight. Like, that's sort of the way they need to be portrayed. They're this huge influential character in one way, but to the eye of the audience, they sort of look like a nobody. They're sort of, again, hiding in plain sight. And Carlo, in his own life, very much felt like he was sort of hiding in plain sight. To his peers in the industry, he's this acclaimed actor who's getting all these roles and everything's so great. He's a family man with 4 kids, but privately, he's living this hell. He's got all this financial debt. He's considered killing himself for an insurance payout to pay for his life. Like, he's living a completely double life here. And so he felt like, I know how to hide in plain sight. It's literally what I do every day. That's my actual life. And so he takes this role, and Carlo does such a world-class job portraying this character who hides in plain sight that the director and all these people who are working on the show, they're like, oh my goodness, Carlo is incredible, and this character that he's portraying, we gotta find a way to expand this character and make them more meaningful in this show. And so they quickly began writing in additional scenes into this big time show for Carlo's character. Again, not because the character was so good, but because Carlo was so good at portraying that character. And as this character's role grew in the show itself began to succeed even more. Like, the audience was like, wow, we love that character. And so the character only grew and became a staple in this show. And it ultimately completely changed Carlo's life. Not only because this would be the opportunity that would make him massively famous and hugely successful, but also because he got paid and he was able to escape the financial hell that he was in. Through this incredible experience, Carlo would get paid millions and millions of dollars and would be nominated for multiple Emmy Awards. Now, you might know Carlo by his full name, which was Giancarlo Esposito. But if that name doesn't ring a bell, you very likely do know him from the life-changing role that he portrayed on the show. He was Gus Fring, the chicken shop kingpin from Breaking Bad. On Thursday, June 6, 2013, a 79-year-old woman named Marilyn Walpole, along with her husband Jim, walked down a busy street in Toronto, Canada. They were on their way back to their hotel after a dinner date at a local Irish pub called PJ O'Brien's. The couple was from Ohio, but they were on the last leg of a cross-country vacation through Canada, and so far the trip had been amazing. And so the retired couple is enjoying their evening, just walking down the road, reminiscing about what an amazing trip it had been. And at some point, as they're walking on the sidewalk, they see up ahead there's all this scaffolding that's been built up right over the sidewalk. There's some sort of construction happening on a building that lined the sidewalk, and there was a platform that was built maybe 8 to 10 feet above the sidewalk, this scaffolding, so that workers could stand on this platform and do construction. And so pedestrians, like Marilyn and Jim, if they wanted to walk on the sidewalk, they would have to walk under the scaffolding. Like, the sidewalk continues unobstructed right underneath. The scaffolding is intentionally built to allow for this tunnel for pedestrians to walk. Like, this is not a big deal. It's very common in cities. And so Marilyn and Jim, they walk underneath the scaffolding, and they're not thinking anything of this. This is completely ordinary. There's other people also walking under the scaffolding. It's all good. But at some point, Jim trips while they're under the scaffolding. And where he lands is where there's a couple pieces of metal kind of poking up out of the ground, some metal tubing. It was kind of obvious and people avoided it, but he's falling, he can't avoid it, and he lands with his neck striking basically this metal tube poking up out of the ground. And so Jim, he hits the ground and the tube cuts his neck wide open. And so suddenly Jim is literally gushing blood all over the sidewalk. And it happens so completely suddenly that Marilyn, she saw her husband trip and she's kind of getting him to stand up. And as she's doing that, she's seeing all this blood pooling everywhere. And she just freezes. She has no idea what's happened. Like, what's going on with Jim? Why is he bleeding? And she starts screaming for help. And there are these two guys. There's nobody else inside the tunnel with them, but there are these two men who don't know each other. They're just strangers out on the street. They hear Marilyn screaming for help, pointing at her husband who's still laying on the ground. And these two guys come running over to her and they're kind of assessing the situation. And they see Jim kind of grabbing at his neck as blood is pouring out of him. And one of the men pulls out his phone and calls 911. So he starts talking to first responders. And the other man, he got down next to Jim. He pulled the scarf off from around his neck and he cradled Jim's head and he wrapped the scarf around Jim's neck and he applied pressure to Jim's neck. And very calmly, he told Jim, "It's okay, we're stopping the bleeding, paramedics are on their way." He tells Marilyn, "It's okay, I've got your husband, you stay calm, everything's gonna be fine." And so Marilyn, who again is just kind of in a panic here, this happens so suddenly, she immediately calmed down because she can tell clearly this second man, the guy holding her husband's head and applying pressure, he's got to be a doctor or at a minimum in the medical field because this guy has just a commanding presence, a very calming presence, and knows what he's doing. And so to Marilyn's great relief, the man on the ground holding her husband's head and the man who had called 911, they stayed with her and Jim all the way until the paramedics arrived, which was only a couple of minutes later. And then after Jim was lifted up by paramedics and put into the back of the ambulance, Marilyn was told, "Hey, get in, you're coming with him." And as she's climbing into the ambulance, she turns and specifically asks the man who was kind of all over it, who was actually handling Jim and actually holding his head and applying pressure. She said, "What's your name?" And the man looked at her and he just said, "My name's John. Everything is fine. Your husband's gonna be okay. Now go." And so Marilyn just felt so reassured by this guy and she said, "Thank you so much." She hops in the ambulance, the door's shut, and they take off to the hospital. The following day, Marilyn was in her husband's hospital room, feeling very grateful that Jim was clearly going to survive here. So ultimately, he had broken a finger and also needed 10 stitches to his neck to close the wound. But from what the doctors told them, basically the cut to his neck, had it been maybe 1/8 of an inch deeper, it almost certainly would have severed his main artery, and then very likely he would have bled to death right there on the sidewalk before paramedics arrived. So this was a very close call. But even without that deep of a penetration, the wound he sustained was still life-threatening. And the doctors told them that, because of the quick action of John and the other man who called 911, that very likely contributed to stabilizing him enough that he was able to get to the hospital and be saved. And so Marilyn and Jim, they can't believe this has happened, but they're so grateful to the medical team and also to the two men from yesterday, who they don't even know who they are. But Marilyn is determined that she needs to find these two men, John and the other guy, and thank them. But she's realizing she really doesn't have a way to contact them. I mean, this all happened so quickly, and all she knows is one guy is named John, and she didn't even have the other guy's name. But luckily, the following day, when Marilyn and Jim were back at their hotel, they got a call from the front desk saying that they had a visitor. And it would turn out it was the man who had called 911. He had been really concerned about Jim and Marilyn and wanted to figure out if they were okay, and he had discovered where they were staying, and so he had come to see them. And so Marilyn and Jim, they come down and they're so thankful, and they come to find out this guy is actually the owner of PJ O'Brien's pub, where they had gone to eat on the night Jim had fallen. And she's just saying, "Thank you so much. Without you, I don't know what would have happened." And then also Marilyn's like, "Do you know the other guy, John, the one who actually was applying pressure to Jim's neck, because he also played a huge role in saving Jim's life." And the owner of the pub, he sort of looked back at Marilyn with a smile on his face, and he's like, "Well, I don't know him personally. We just happened to be walking down the street when you called out for help. But, I know who John is. Lots of people know who John is. In fact, honestly, you probably know who John is." Because it would turn out John was not a doctor, the way Marilyn assumed he was, based on how easily he stepped into the fray of this medical crisis and knew what to do and put pressure on Jim's neck and seemed so calm. None of that had to do with medical training. He was not medically trained. Instead, John has this skill. He's this really charismatic, really commanding presence where every time he's in a room, people just look to him and think, oh, he's got to be in charge, because he's just got this way about him, this X factor. And he carries that X factor on screen. Every role this guy plays in movies and TV shows, he is the leader. He is in charge, and it's so effortless because that's kind of his thing. And so from that day forward, Marilyn and Jim had a brand new favorite actor, John Malkovich, the multi-time award-winning actor who literally saved Jim's life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you two stories. The first story is about this woman in China who goes on a hike into this beautiful forest, and it quickly spirals into a complete nightmare. And the second story is about this small village in Taiwan where this very strange event happens. And it spooks the villagers so badly that the Taiwanese government actually investigated. And what they discovered defies any logical explanation. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, on the like button's birthday, offer to bring the cake. But when you sing them happy birthday, make sure you replace the candles with TNT. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Early on the morning of February 16th, 2020, a 39-year-old woman named Faye stepped out of a convenience store in a small village in China. She was wearing a bright red distinctive coat, and in her hands were a whole bunch of snacks that she had just purchased. So Faye had lived in this village her whole life. She was a very simple person, and she had a really specific daily schedule that she basically always adhered to. And it was, she would get up early, she would throw on her jacket, and she would head out to this convenience store, get some snacks, and then she would either go back home where she lived with her husband, or she would go to her parents' house or her sister's house to pay them a visit. And that was basically what she did every single day. And so this day had started exactly the same as every other day. And after she left the store and she began eating some snacks and, thinking about where she was gonna go next, whether it was her house or a relative's house, she's walking down this road when suddenly she hears people calling out to her. And so she stops and she turns, and there are these 5 people that are clustered together standing at the top of this trailhead. So Faye's village was home to this beautiful hiking trail that started right where these people were standing. The trail went up this mountainside and up into this huge forest where there were all these ponds and waterfalls. I mean, it was strikingly beautiful. And that area, the forest with all the ponds, was called the 18 Ponds of the Dragon King. It was called that because there were literally 18 ponds sort of scattered throughout this forest. And then also the village where Faye lived that was right up against it, well, it meant Dragon King in Chinese. But even though Faye had grown up here, she had never once gone on that hiking trail. She had heard about it, and loads of her friends and family had all been up there and talked about its striking beauty. But Faye, she had always stayed away. But there was actually a pretty good reason for that. So Faye, when she was younger, she had this tumor. And in order to get rid of it, she had to take all this medication that was pretty physically harmful and left her with some pretty serious long-term effects. And even though the tumor, did go away and she recovered, that process of recovering and taking all those medications and going to the doctor, it sort of instilled in her this mentality that she was frail and delicate and that she shouldn't take any chances and risk getting hurt. And so she really never did anything that was even remotely risky or even perceived to be risky. Like, for example, hiking up into the mountains. Too risky for her, and so she avoided it. And instead, she kind of developed this really simple, safe daily routine of getting snacks and visiting family, and that's all she ever did. And while in some ways this did, keep Faye safe, it also made her very isolated and lonely. She didn't really have any friends or do anything. She was just kind of stuck in her ways. And so Faye is on this road, and these villagers, these 5 villagers over at the trailhead, have just deliberately called to her by name. They're saying, "Hey, Faye, over here." And Faye's turned and she's looking at them, and they're clearly getting ready to go hike up into the 18 ponds of the Dragon King. And they tell her, "Hey, come with us, come hiking with us, come check it out." And for Faye, this was so unusual. This was not even remotely how her life went, that there was something in her that for a second just felt really excited. I mean, she did sort of rely on her schedule and her discipline of doing the same thing every day. It kept her safe. But this sudden invitation from these people, these villagers, it just felt like, why not? Why not do something different for once? And she's also thinking, how dangerous can it be? I'm with other people. They seem really competent. Maybe this is a good idea. Maybe I'll just go with them. What the heck? See what happens. And so Faye found herself just sort of drifting over to these very friendly 5 people and saying, "You know what? What the heck? Yeah, I'll come with you. I've never been up there. I'm sure it's great. Let's go." And so sure enough, Faye and her newfound 5 friends from the village, they begin hiking up this trail. And over the next couple of hours, Faye is seeing a beautiful landscape that she was so close to her whole life that now she's seeing for the first time. And it's revelatory. She can't believe that she's lived this close to this majesty for so long and she's never seen it. This was a life-changing experience for her. And so her mood is just so good. And these 5 people are so wonderful, and they're all chattering and talking about their lives. And, Faye's opening up about hers and her health scares and all these different things. And eventually they make their way into this forest, which is really dense, but they eventually reach one of these ponds, one of the 18 ponds, and it's got this huge clearing and all the sunlight's pouring in, and there's a waterfall leading into the pond. It's truly stunningly beautiful. And Faye's friends, they all take a seat right on the shore of the pond, and they break out some snacks. And Faye, she sits down, she's got those snacks she bought from the convenience store. And they basically have a picnic right on the shore. And for Faye, it was this was the most amazing day, potentially, of her whole life. She had broken out of her comfort zone. She had met these wonderful people who were so inclusive. And here she is experiencing this unbelievable natural beauty, the day couldn't get any better. But as she was sitting there on the side of the pond, enjoying this beautiful scene, she started to feel really intensely fatigued. And at first she's thinking, oh, of course, I don't really get out much and exercise much, and I just hiked up this mountain into this forest. Of course I'm tired. But she felt herself kind of slumping back on the rock she was on and almost positioning herself she might lay down and sleep. And then before long, it was the world around her began getting hazy, and she could see her friends still talking and they weren't really looking at her. They're just kind of enjoying their food. And then it was Faye just could not keep her eyes open, and she put her head down, closed her eyes, and she fell asleep. When Faye woke up again, she was still laying in that same spot, but now it was dark. And also, her 5 friends were gone. She was all alone next to this pond in the middle of this forest. And for Faye, it was immediately this jolt of panic rocketed through her. She starts looking around for these, friends of hers. They've got to be here somewhere. They wouldn't just abandon her. They were so nice. How could this possibly be? But she's looking around and all she can see is just darkness. There's some moonlight coming through the clearing over the pond, but when she looked into the tree line, it was just all dark and there's no one. All she can hear is birds and insects, night sounds. And remember, Faye is not somebody who would ever find herself in this position. This is so far out of her comfort zone. Alone at night in this forest, in this austere environment, suddenly it felt very austere. And she's terrified. And at the same time, her mind starts telling her, oh my gosh, this whole thing was a trap. Those 5 people weren't my friends. They brought me up here. They tricked me. They drugged me, or maybe they've left and they're gonna come back and hurt me. And so she's thinking oh, I'm in danger. I have to get out of here. And she turns and she looks at the trail that brought them up here. And all she sees is just this dark tree line. And there's this cut path through the trees that's basically pitch black. And she's thinking, I have to walk through that alone in the middle of the night. She didn't have a light or anything that would help guide her way out of here. But as she's sitting there panicking, she's thinking, I have to go right now, it's life or death. And so she stands up and immediately she feels really weak on her feet. Like she's super fatigued still, but it's like adrenaline is coursing through her body. She's got to get out of here. And she starts stumbling her way into the tree line where it's super dark, and she's trying to stay on this trail, but she keeps deviating because it's so dark, and she's bumping into trees, and she keeps hearing noises all around her that she's convinced are these 5 people coming back to hurt her, or animals, or she doesn't know what. I mean, she is in full panic mode here, but just for hours, or what felt like hours, she just stumbled through these trails, getting completely disoriented, and finally she comes to the stream, and she just stops. And she's sitting there and she realizes, the sun is starting to come up. So she kneels down and she scoops some water into her mouth. And right as the sun comes up across the mountainside, there's enough light that miraculously she realizes she can actually see a path down the side of the mountain that she believes will bring her back to her village. Like she's gonna get out of here unscathed, presumably. And so she kind of catches her breath, she gets another sip from the stream, and then with the help of the sunlight, she navigated her way to this trail that she could see, and down the mountain she went. And as she was going down this mountain, she looked down towards her village, and she saw clearly there was a big group of people, presumably villagers, out looking for her, that were right down on the trail, sort of like the beginning of the trail. And Faye, she's waving and calling out to them, and a few of the people in the crowd, they're looking up at her, and maybe from the distance they couldn't really tell who she was or what she was doing, but there was some level of recognition, but she couldn't really tell what the reaction of the crowd was. But she had gotten their attention, and Faye's so excited, and down the hill she goes. Suddenly she feels totally rejuvenated because she's gonna be okay, and she gets closer to this big crowd of people, and she sees now it's friends, it's family, it's definitely her people. But the looks on their faces are not the looks that Faye is expecting. I mean, she did understand that, clearly I've been out here at least for several hours. They must have organized the search party. They've been worried about me, but here I am. Like, they gotta be relieved now, right? Like, they found me. But no, the looks on all these people's faces were of shock, were of horror, not really sure what to make of Faye coming down the mountainside toward them. And then, when Faye got close enough to the group that she could actually make out individual faces, Faye saw her sister in the crowd. And she waved to her sister and said, "Hey, I'm okay, it's okay, everything's fine, like come on, everything's fine." And Faye's sister kind of broke ranks very hesitantly, and then she finally jogs up to Faye and the two embrace, and it's this really emotional moment. And Faye's sister says to Faye, "Where have you been?" And Faye kind of steps back from her and says, "Oh, yesterday or a few hours ago, I don't know, I kind of lost track of time, but I think it was yesterday. I saw these 5 people and, we kind of made our way into the mountains. I don't know, I shouldn't have done it, but I fell asleep and, here I am. I'm so sorry if I scared you, but I'm okay." But Faye's sister, it's like she was hearing what Faye was saying, but couldn't process it. And eventually her sister kind of stepped back and looked at Faye and just said, "That can't be true. You've been gone for 17 days. Faye didn't really have time to appreciate what she had just been told, nor did the group really have time to appreciate that Faye apparently has shown back up again. Because pretty much immediately, Faye was rushed to the hospital, where doctors discovered she had lost 60 pounds, she was horribly malnourished and dehydrated. I mean, they didn't understand how she was still alive. And while Faye is being treated, she began to hear what had happened over the past 17 days she had been gone. They had security footage that showed when Faye went into the woods because she had on that bright red distinctive coat. They caught her walking into the forest. There she goes. So they knew she was up in the 7.5-mile stretch, which is this, 18 Ponds of the Dragon King. It's a distinctive 7.5-mile plot. They knew she had to be up there. And also because this was around the time of COVID, there were really strict checkpoints of all the other villages in the area. So anybody going in and out of these villages, they'd be documented. And they knew Faye had not gone into any of the surrounding villages. So she had to be in the 18 Ponds of the Dragon King, that 7.5-mile stretch. But despite launching a huge search party into that 7.5-mile stretch to go look for her, and also firing off fireworks left and right to try to get her attention, not only did nobody find any trace of Faye, but Faye would also say, "I never heard fireworks, I never heard or saw any searchers." From her perspective, it literally felt like she had just fallen asleep for a few hours
and woken up, and here she was, not 17 days. But eventually, Faye would actually go into detail about the specifics of what she remembered about this ordeal. Namely, she would talk about those 5 people, her new friends, who sort of encouraged her to go up into the 18 pawns of the Dragon King. And she remembered their names, what they looked like, she remembered discussions she had with them, and she painted them as wonderful people, but it's like she just woke up and they were gone. And so she thought, maybe they had tricked her and, maybe they drugged her and that's why she can't remember this stuff, or she didn't know what, but she couldn't reconcile the fact that they seemed like such nice people, but must have had something to do with what's happened here. But after Faye said that, her family, they kind of looked at each other like, Faye, those can't be the 5 people you were with. And Faye's like, why? And they're like, because the 5 people you named and described, they've been dead for a long time. Now, Faye was incredulous, but when they reviewed the security footage that showed Faye clearly in her bright red distinctive coat walking up the trail into the 18 pawns, there was nobody else with her. Those 5 people, they're not on camera. So the 18 pawns of the Dragon King is not just a beautiful hiking destination. It's also believed to be haunted. Locals claim that when they look up at the mountainside that the trail passes through and then up to that forest as well, they can sometimes see these eerie blue lights moving around in the trees that nobody can explain. There's a story that, people that have died, their spirits sort of haunt this area looking for living people to switch places with. In fact, when Faye began coming down the mountainside and she looked and saw that huge crowd of people that she believed was basically, her search party out to look for her, well, in reality, that wasn't the case. One of the locals had looked up and seen what he thought was another one of those lights, not a blue light, but a red light. It was Faye's red jacket. He had seen this red thing bouncing around off in the distance, and he thought it was, one of these strange lights, a ghost, let's say. And so he had told people in the village, and everybody was really excited, and they ran out to go see what it was, and it sort of was a ghost. It was Faye, who'd been gone for 17 days coming down the mountain, and nobody could believe it. They were so shocked. And so to this day, nobody knows what actually happened to Faye. All we know is we have her on camera disappearing into this trail, into this forest, in the mountainside, and then turning back up 17 days later. Keep in mind, before this, the longest anybody had survived out there after getting lost was 12 days, and it was this young man who was really fit, who barely survived. Faye was in horrible shape, and she was out there for 17 days, but somehow she showed up alive. Faye still lives in the village today, and her story, at least from her perspective, has never changed. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring this video, and for allowing me to talk about therapy and how it helped get me to where I am today. When I got out of the military in 2017, that was arguably one of the hardest times in my entire life. Even though I was surrounded by friends and family and everybody wanted me to be successful as a civilian, I just wasn't able to kind of reacclimate back into the civilian world. It was like my mindset was still trapped in the military and I just couldn't make the jump. And so as a result, I kind of bottled up my emotions and sort of got easily frustrated with everybody around me. I was mad all the time. But I was kind of blind to it. I actually thought I was just fine. It was not until my friends and family intervened and told me, you really need to get some serious help here. You're kind of falling apart. You need some help. And I took their advice and I did go see a therapist, and honestly, that changed my life. In early 2018, when I actually saw a therapist, the thing that really did make the change in me was the therapist was able to kind of give me perspective on my life and kind of show me really kind of where I stand and what was going for me and what I needed to work on. And it really helped guide me towards making better decisions. And today, I still rely on therapy because, I'm in this world of content creation where there's so much pressure on you to, keep your views up and look the part and be happy and successful and all these different things. But I'm a human. I have a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that I need to work out as well. And luckily my therapist kind of keeps me grounded and keeps giving me the perspective that I need to keep me grounded. And so if you're struggling right now, either because you are, or because maybe your circle of friends and family have kind of clued you in that maybe you could use some help, consider giving therapy a try. And a great starting point for therapy is BetterHelp. If this sounds helpful, you can go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen to get 10% off your first month of therapy. One morning in the spring of 1959, a middle-aged civil engineer named Wu Chiu biked through his rural town in Taiwan. He was on his way home from work, and normally he sort of enjoyed this bike ride home. He would take his time and look at the beautiful temple and all the marketplaces. But today, he was not looking at the scenery. He was in a huge rush because he had gotten word that his wife had become horribly sick. And so Wu is pedaling as fast as he possibly can, trying to get home to his wife to help her and take care of her. But as he got to his neighborhood, he started to realize that he was really gassed. Like literally pedaling to his house was just unbelievably exhausting. Now he was sort of sprinting, but at the same time, Wu was a pretty athletic guy. And so this type of a ride was something that he should have been able to handle. But it just sort of seemed like there was a weight attached to him, like he was pulling an extra 100 pounds or something. But regardless, Wu pushed through the pain, knowing he had to get to his wife at all costs, and he turned the corner onto his street, and as he was making his final approach to his house, he saw one of his neighbors. And even though Wu was completely in a rush, he was also very polite. And so even though he's like, sweating and hustling, he still took the time to turn and wave to his neighbor. And his neighbor, who clearly looked at Wu, made eye contact with him, saw it was Wu. Instead of waving back, they kind of scowled at Wu, like they were disgusted by him. They didn't wave back and they turned and just went the other way. And Wu's like, what was that about? What did I do? But again, Wu has to get home. So he sort of wrote that off and he's like, okay, keep on pedaling. He gets even closer to his house. And then it just so happens another neighbor comes outside. And again, Wu's politeness comes through and he's like sweating profusely. He's like, hey, how are you? And this neighbor as well looks at Wu with this look of total disdain on their face. Like there's something wrong with Wu. And Wu's like, what did I do? What's going on here? And so that neighbor does not wave back. They go back inside their house. But again, Wu really can't focus on this weirdness with his neighbors. He needs to get home to his wife. And so again, with his heavy legs, he finally gets to his house, parks his bike, and runs inside to see his wife. Wu would find his wife in their bedroom, in bed, and she was looking very pale and sick. Her name was Lin Wang Yao. She was 37 years old, and generally speaking, she was a pretty frail person who was sort of prone to minor illnesses all the time. And so, Wu was sort of accustomed to her not doing so well. But as soon as he saw his wife, he could tell that whatever was going on with her was serious. This was not one of her typical bouts of, minor illnesses. Something was wrong here. And so Wu immediately began to tend to his wife. He made her some soup and some tea, but, Lin barely could sip either of them. And Lin also, she had this fever that just kept getting worse and worse. And, Wu was hoping she would break the fever at some point. But, all night as Wu was up tending to her, her fever just kept getting worse. And so Wu, he really didn't know what to do. And this is 1959. They're in a rural village in Taiwan. And so it was difficult to get to a hospital. And so Wu really wanted to find a way to treat his wife at home. And he was just praying that, over the next 24 hours or so, she would show signs of getting better. But over the next couple of days, Lin did not get better. Her fever never broke. She basically stopped eating and drinking. And it was like she was drifting in and out of consciousness. And then finally, after 3 days of this, Wu knew, if I don't get my wife to a hospital, no matter how hard it is to do that, she might not make it. The primary hurdle for Wu to get Lin to the hospital was actually just transportation. He didn't have a car, but he did know that one of his neighbors on his street had a donkey cart. And so he could maybe load his wife into that and they could get her to the hospital in the cart. And so Wu, he went outside and he found the neighbor who happened to be outside, actually with their donkey cart, and he flagged them down and he asked them if they'd be willing to transport Lin to the hospital in their cart. But just like a few days earlier, when Wu had been biking on his street and his neighbors had been totally weird to him and sort of looked at him with these obvious looks of disgust, this neighbor, who knew Wu really well, looked at Wu and basically gave him one of those looks, like, you gross person, and he turned around like he wasn't even gonna talk to Wu. But then Wu, in desperation, just says, look, my wife, she's dying. She needs to get to the hospital. Please do it for her. And at that, this neighbor, clearly despite their misgivings, sort of turns back around and says, fine, we can use the cart and get her to the hospital. And so Wu and this neighbor, they go into Wu's house, they scoop up Lin, they put her on the cart, and it takes several hours, but they do eventually get her to the hospital. And by the time they're there, Lin is basically unconscious. They rush her inside, and the doctors and nurses, they try to do everything they can to stabilize Lin. But as soon as she was admitted, it was like her condition only got worse and worse. And that night, she slipped into a coma, and then she died. Wu was devastated. He and the neighbor took Lin's body, put it back on the donkey cart, and brought it back to their town. And then Wu began setting up for a funeral service. So in Taiwan, it's customary during funerals to have the body of the loved one be brought into the house where it stays for 7 days before they're cremated. And so Wu, after getting Lin's body back home, he put her into a coffin, set her up in the living room, and then over the next several days, Wu was at home next to his dead wife as friends and family, and even the neighbors who, clearly had some issue with Wu, they all came in to pay their respects. And while this was happening, Wu, who was already devastated at the loss of his wife, as he would listen to people come in and pray over the body and sort of talk to the body as if she was still alive and talk about how wonderful she was, it really hit Wu hard because it was like he was suddenly realizing how different his life was going to be without his wife. Lin was a very simple woman. She was illiterate, she really didn't travel, and she was very introverted and quiet, but she was a wonderful wife. She took care of Wu. She cared about him deeply. She was a wonderful cook. And just generally, she made people around her feel safe and happy. And so, Wu, it's like he just found himself over and over having these fits of just crying. Like he can't believe that Lin is now gone. But on the third day after Lin had passed away, so now we're about halfway through this funeral service, which takes about a week, Wu was in his living room dealing with this overwhelming sadness about losing his wife, and there's this procession of people coming in and out of the house. And as Wu was sitting there, there was sort of a cadence and a rhythm to how the days were going. But at some point, it was like everybody in the room just suddenly went completely silent, and then people began to gasp. And Wu, he was sort of head down dealing with his sadness, and he sort of noticed the change in the room, and he heard people gasping, and he looked up and he noticed a few of the mourners. They weren't just gasping, they were open-mouthed and horrified, and they were looking at the casket. And so Wu went from the mourners and he looks over at the casket, and there in this open casket is Lin, except now she's sitting upright, looking around the room, clearly alive. Now, at first, Wu's reaction was, oh my goodness, my wife must have just slipped into a really deep coma, so deep that the doctors could not distinguish it from death. And so this is a mistake. Like she was never dead. She's just, waken up from her coma. But at the same time, as Wu's having this immediate reaction to seeing his wife sitting up in her coffin, he's thinking, but over these 3 days that I've not left her side, I've been with her body the whole time. She's not moved, she's not made a sound, she's certainly not had anything to eat or drink. Like this just doesn't seem possible. And so Wu and the other mourners, after the shock of seeing this sort of wore off, everybody kind of jumped into action and they rushed over to the casket and they very gently lifted Lin out of the casket and they carried her over to her bed and they laid her down, and Lin immediately kind of gestured for water. She was too weak to speak. She had lost a bunch of weight, but she's gesturing for water, and so they give her some water and she sips the water, and everyone's looking at Wu like, we have to get her to the hospital. Like, what else can we possibly do? But Wu, he's looking at his wife and she's so frail. She really seems like now she is on the precipice of dying here. And he's thinking, she can't survive another donkey cart ride to the hospital. And so we have to keep her here and hope that she, recovers enough that maybe in a day or two we could bring her to the hospital, but certainly not now. And so over the next couple of hours, Wu, along with some friends and family, just stayed by Lin's bedside, constantly checking on her, making sure she really was alive. And, she was, albeit, very subdued, but she continued to drink water and had a little food. And amazingly, over the span of only a few hours, Lin went from basically literally being dead to actually seeming to get a whole lot better. In fact, to the point where, Lin was actually sitting up in bed and, stretching and moving around as if she was completely fine. In fact, in Wu's opinion, it almost seemed like within a few hours, she was actually physically almost better off than she was normally when she was alive. Like it was a miracle how quickly she was recovering. And so by that night, when Lin really did seem like she was effectively back to her normal self, the mourners all left and said, okay, well, I guess Lin's okay. And they left, and then it was just Wu and Lin. And Wu had no idea how to handle any of this. He was just so grateful that his wife was alive, even though, again, none of this made any sense. Like, this is so shocking. But he's just grateful that she's alive. The next day, when they woke up, Lin was so much better that she was out of bed, walking around the house, really excited to face the day. And Wu's like, dude, you were dead yesterday. Like, what's going on here? But Lin said to him, hey, I want to go out on a walk. You want to go on a walk with me, go to the temple? And Wu, he's looking at Lin, still like unable to comprehend what's happened here. But he's thinking, she does seem like she's in great health right now, and if she wants to go for a walk, great, I'll go with her. And so the two of them went outside and they began to walk. And as they're walking, Wu, he's a pretty athletic guy, remember? He found himself barely able to keep pace with Lin, who was like speed walking towards the temple. And on top of that, as they're walking and Wu's like, gassed as he's trying to keep up with his wife, periodically neighbors would, wave to Lin and Wu, and for just a brief second they would chat. And as Wu listened to Lin speak, he began to notice something really strange. That Lin, maybe he didn't notice it before, but he was definitely noticing it when she was speaking to other people. She just sounded different, like her accent was different. It did not sound like his wife. And the weirdness around Lin's miraculous recovery only got more weird over time. Before Lin died and came back to life, she had been illiterate. But now, she was not only able to read, but she could also read and speak fluent Mandarin, a language she didn't know before she died. Also, Lin used to be a really skilled cook who loved cooking meat dishes in particular. But now that Lin has recovered, she no longer wanted to eat meat. She said she was a vegetarian and basically stopped cooking. Also, Lin began speaking with real authority about the professions of accounting and bookkeeping. And then also she advised her husband to quit his job as an engineer and open up a building materials shop in town because there was a real need for it and he'd make real money that way. And believe it or not, like Wu, he doesn't understand what's going on with his wife, but she really seemed like a force to be reckoned with now. And however she had gained all this extra knowledge, it really seemed like she was sharp these days. And so he was like, all right. And he quits his job as an engineer, opens up this building materials shop, and really quickly, he and his wife began making real money, more money than they had ever made before. And while all this was happening, Wu and Lin became the biggest curiosity in town. The story of how Lin had miraculously come back to life with all these bizarre personality changes, not only was that spreading all around town, but it eventually spread all across the country. It was like everybody was talking about Lin. In fact, this story spread so far that it eventually reached the Taiwanese government. And when they heard about it, they were so intrigued, they decided they would investigate. And so on March 17th, 1962, the Taiwanese government sent for Lin. And Lin was very happy to go. She was ready to tell her story and answer any questions they had. This was all just kind of exciting. The idea that the government wanted to know how she had made this unbelievable recovery. And so the government, they scoop her up and they bring her to this army hospital and they tell her she's gonna be meeting with the chief physician there. And so the chief physician, he's inside of the room, he's waiting for Lin. He's never met her before. He's only been told roughly what the story is. There's this woman who's acting really funny after coming back from the dead, and okay, fine, I'm gonna talk to her and see what's going on. And so Lin, she walks in the room and the chief physician, he looks at her, she's an ordinary looking woman, and she walks over to him, and before he can even begin a line of questioning, Lin looks at him like with a double take, like there's a moment of recognition, and she says to the chief physician, "Uncle?" And the chief physician is like, "Why are you calling me uncle?" And then Lin would go on to explain why she had just called him uncle, and the chief physician was so shocked by her story that he left the room and he called for his wife. And then when his wife came to the hospital, he didn't tell her what was going on. He just said, "Come with me." She walks into the room with the chief physician, he and his wife, and Lin, who's never met this woman, and the woman has never met Lin, they see each other for the first time, and Lin looks at her and just goes, "Auntie." And it was at this point that Lin revealed to the chief physician and his wife that Lin really was not her name. That's what people called her, but that wasn't who she was. Her real name was Zhu Shuhua, and the chief physician and his wife literally couldn't believe it because they had not given any information about their personal lives to Lin. They've only listened to her story, and she's just offered up what she claims her name is. She's called them uncle and auntie, and wouldn't you know it, the chief physician and his wife, they did have a niece whose name was Zhu Shuhua, and a year earlier, she, their niece, had gone missing. She'd gone missing during the Chinese Civil War, and she had been presumed dead, but nobody had ever found her body. According to Lin, Zhu did die during that war. She was robbed and murdered by a group of fishermen. And then after she was killed, her spirit was sort of stuck in this purgatory for some time. But then, a year after Zhu's death, when Lin died, Lin said that Zhu's spirit entered Lin's body, and thus, she came back to life, Zhu did, but in a different body. And so Lin basically was telling the chief physician and his wife that She was Zhu. She had been reincarnated in Lin's body. And as crazy as this story sounded, the chief physician and his wife couldn't help but notice that as Lin was speaking, her accent was exactly like Zhu's. In fact, just generally speaking, Lin was acting exactly like their niece. She really did seem like the reincarnated version of Zhu. And then when they dug deeper and spoke more to Lin and also her husband Wu, the physician and his wife learned that, Lin, when she woke up and was reincarnated, suddenly she was a vegetarian, just like Zhu. Suddenly, Lin was interested in accounting and bookkeeping. Well, that was something that Zhu was interested in. And also, the biggest one was that Lin had been illiterate, but then she wakes up and suddenly she reads and speaks Mandarin fluently, the language that Zhu read and spoke. And so the chief physician, he couldn't help but start to believe that maybe Lin was telling the truth here. Maybe this really was his niece's reincarnated spirit. And so, as sort of strange as it was, he told the Taiwanese government that, you know what, there's something weird happening here, and, I can't help but believe that maybe there's some truth to this story. But if we really want to pressure test it, Lin claims that she knows who killed my niece. Like, she knows who killed her, because now she's Zhu. She said it was this particular group of fishermen. And actually, Lin had given the names of these fishermen that apparently robbed and killed Zhu. And so the chief physician told the government, why don't we investigate my niece's disappearance as a murder and go talk to those fishermen and see if that holds up. And so that's what the government did. They tracked these fishermen down, but unfortunately, only one of them was still alive. But they interviewed this guy, and Lin would actually say that particular fisherman, he was not one of the aggressors. He was actually the only fisherman in the group who tried to save Zhu, even though obviously she did get killed, but that fisherman had tried to stop what was happening to her. And when the government talked to him, he would say that, yes, unfortunately, she was killed, and I did try to stop it, but I just couldn't. Keep in mind, this fisherman had not been given any information. This is entirely like a brand new investigation. He has no idea what they know. But he basically exactly mirrored what Lin said happened. And so based on this, they actually closed Zhu Shua's case. It was labeled a disappearance. They changed it to a murder, and they labeled her killers as the fishermen who were deceased at the time. But they were labeled as her killers, and they closed the case based entirely on, a reincarnated spirit's testimony. And there's one more thing. Back in the beginning of the story, when Wu is hustling home, biking as fast as he can to get to his sick wife, and he has those weird encounters with his neighbors, well, it would turn out when those neighbors were interviewed, they would say that the reason they gave those looks to Wu, those looks of disgust and disdain, is because, one, they knew Wu was married to Lin, and they were also aware that she was sick in bed. But here comes Wu pedaling up the road, and he's got this woman sitting on the back of his bike that is clearly not his wife. And so everyone's reaction to that is, Wu is having an affair on his poor wife who's sick in bed. What a horrible person. Now, Wu swore there was no woman on his bike, but he would recall that the bike did feel really heavy, like he was pulling extra weight at the end there. Later, Lin would say that actually Zhu's spirit had come down and hopped on the back of Wu's bike, and it was her basically riding along, hitching a ride up to their house. She was the woman that the neighbors were seeing. But Wu, he was so focused on getting home, even though he felt that heavy weight, he never turned around, and so he didn't see her. And then once Lin passed away, Zhu's spirit, who was now at the home, sort of waiting for this to happen, she switched places with her. For the rest of her life, Lin would live as Zhu, and she would become a community and spiritual leader. And she would pass away in 2018 at the age of 97, and at her funeral, there would be banners hung that actually said both names, Lin and Zhu. And so if reincarnation is real, this story might just be one of the most credible cases ever recorded. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, we have a very special bonus video for you guys. It's a collection of 5 fan favorite stories that will leave you asking, what are the odds? Now, these 5 fan favorite stories have all been re-edited for today's episode. So even if you may have heard or seen one or all of them before, it'll still feel like a brand new viewing experience. But before we get into today's 5 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please ask the like button. If you could please just log into their Netflix account to just watch a couple of shows, and then you'll log right out. And then after you get those login instructions, go ahead and instantly change the password and then log out. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's 5 stories.
In 2007, 60-year-old Michael Dick was living in Bow, East London with his wife and 2 daughters. While his life was not exactly exciting, it was good. He lived in a quiet and safe neighborhood, and Michael, who used to be a carpenter, was now semi-retired and got to spend the bulk of his time with his friends and family. But that year, something really started to bother him. 10 years prior, Michael had split up with his first wife, and after their divorce was finalized, his ex-wife and the daughter they had together, her name was Lisa, and she was 21 at the time, those 2 stayed in the family home in Sudbury, England, and Michael moved south about an hour and a half to Bow, East London. The divorce had been quite messy, and so Michael had not only lost touch with his ex-wife, he had also lost touch with Lisa. And so fast forward 10 years back to 2007, and Michael and Lisa had not spoken since the divorce, and Michael found himself suddenly feeling this unbelievable wave of grief over the loss of his relationship with his first child. And so after speaking with his current wife and his 2 other daughters, he decided that he had to go find Lisa. He had to be reunited with her. The only problem was he didn't know where Lisa lived, he didn't have her contact information, and he didn't know where his ex-wife was, so he couldn't even ask her how to get in touch with Lisa. However, he did have the street address of where they used to live in Sudbury, England, and so he decided that would be his starting point. So in August of that year, Michael and his 2 other younger daughters, they hopped in the car and they left Bow, East London, and they headed up to Sudbury, and when they got there, Michael navigated to his old street, which had brick houses lining each side of the road, and he drove down until he spotted his old house, and he parked right out front, and then he alone hopped out of the car and he walked up to the front door. He took a deep breath and then he knocked on the door. When the door opened, it was not Lisa, it was not his ex-wife, it was some other family that he didn't know, and they didn't know Lisa or his ex-wife, and so they said, good luck finding your daughter, but we don't have any information for you. And so Michael was crushed, but he thanked them, and he turned around, and he went back to the car, and he told his other daughters about what he had just learned, and then from there, the trio just kind of began driving around Sudbury, half looking for Lisa out on the streets, although none of them thought they would actually find her, and then also kind of discussing what they were going to do next, because now they had nothing. And so as they're driving around the streets of Sudbury, they come to the realization that their best bet at finding Lisa is putting some sort of story in the local newspaper that hopefully she would see, and then she would contact Michael. And so they drove to the headquarters of the local paper, the Suffolk Free Press, and they went inside and they managed to speak to a reporter, and after telling the reporter Michael's story about how he's lost touch with Lisa, the reporter thought, you know what, this is actually a pretty interesting story, and I'd be happy to do a small feature on you guys. And so the reporter, along with a photographer, brought Michael and his 2 daughters outside. They took a picture of them, and then they told Michael, in the next edition of the paper that will run in a couple of days, we'll run this picture along with a little write-up about how you're looking for Lisa, and we'll put your contact information in there, and hopefully she sees it and she reaches out to you, and you can be reunited and live happily ever after. And so Michael thanked the reporter and the photographer, and then he and his other 2 daughters hopped in the car and headed back to Bow, East London. In 2007, at the same time that Michael was beginning his search for Lisa, Lisa was actually beginning to think, you know what, I want to go find my dad. Lisa was now 31 years old. She had 3 kids of her own. She was married. She had moved out of Sudbury to a neighboring town. And she was thinking, you know, I really want to have a relationship with my dad again so that my kids can have a relationship with him. And so she began speaking with her mother and with friends about how she should go about finding her dad, because like Michael, she didn't have his contact information. She didn't have a phone number. She didn't know anyone who would. And then when she went on social media to look for him, he wasn't on there. And so she was kind of at a loss. Then one day in August, she was at her office and she was in the break room and she saw a copy of the Suffolk Free Press sitting out on the coffee table. So she picked it up and she began flipping through the pages. And then suddenly she stopped when she saw a picture of herself. She saw her and her mother walking along the streets of Sudbury. She had been in Sudbury just a couple of days ago to talk to her mom about finding her dad and kind of strategies for how to go about doing that. And then Lisa glanced at the caption for this photo and she nearly fell off of her chair. The man and the 2 girls who were the main focus of this photo that Lisa was in were her father and her 2 stepsisters. She just didn't recognize them. She just saw herself in the back of this photo. So purely by chance, after being apart for over a decade, on the only day that Lisa happened to be in Sudbury talking to her mom about finding her father, she was literally 100 feet behind her father and her stepsisters as they were looking for her and putting out this ad in the paper to hopefully find her. And this one photo that the photographer took captured all of them in the same frame. Lisa would, of course, read the article and get her father's contact information. She would reach out, and initially Michael actually thought it was a scam and didn't believe this was actually Lisa calling to say, I found myself in the picture of you in Sudbury. But eventually he was convinced and he drove right out to Sudbury and he got a chance to meet his grandkids for the first time. And today he and Lisa are still in touch. In 1964, during his final semester of college in Wisconsin, a 21-year-old man named Harry decided to take an acting class. He believed it would be an easy A, and he'd always been pretty shy, and so he figured this class might be able to help him get over that. But this class wound up having a much larger impact on Harry's life than he ever could have imagined. Not only did he meet his future wife in this class, but he also realized he loved acting, something he never thought he would like, and he decided after college that that was the thing he was going to pursue. And so after he graduates later that year, he and his girlfriend get married, and then they fly out to Hollywood, California, where Harry auditions for Columbia Pictures' New Talent Program, which is basically this program that's designed to help new actors and actresses get parts in Hollywood because it's so hard to do that. And so he's accepted into this program. He signs a contract with them that pays him almost nothing. And right away, they start shopping him around for different parts in TV shows and movies, but nobody is interested in Harry. Nobody. The only roles he was getting were incredibly minor and usually non-speaking, and so it was really not advancing his career. Then, in 1966, so 2 years after he and his wife had arrived in Hollywood, Harry received what seemed like his first big break. He was offered a speaking role in a movie, although it was a very minor role. It was a 60-second bit where Harry basically walked on screen in this hotel, and he started calling out for a particular guest, and when he finds this guest, he walks up and gives him a piece of paper, and then he leaves. So it's a forgettable scene, but it's a real scene in a real movie. And so this was a big deal for Harry. And so after Harry goes over to the studio and he films this whole scene and it's all done, he goes back over to the headquarters of the New Talent Program at Columbia Pictures. And as soon as he goes inside, one of the producers that was in charge of this New Talent Program, who had apparently had a chance already to see this 60-second scene in this movie that Harry was in, he calls Harry over and asks him to go up to his office for a second. And so the pair go up to his office, they both sit down, and the guy looks at him and says, look, I just gotta shoot you straight here. You're not gonna make it in Hollywood. You're not gonna be a movie star. When Tony Curtis was told to carry groceries across this room in one of his first movies, everybody knew right away as he's carrying those groceries that guy, he's going to be a movie star. You could see it in the scene, even though all he was doing was carrying groceries. And when you did your scene as the bellhop walking around the hotel, I just didn't see it. You don't have the X factor. you're not gonna be a movie star. For reference, Tony Curtis, the guy this producer was referencing, was a huge movie star in the 1950s and 1960s. And so Harry, after getting this horrible comment made about him, he pauses for a second, and then he leans across the table and looks at this producer and squints his eyes and says, you know, if Tony was such a good actor, shouldn't we have believed he was just a grocery delivery boy, not a movie star? And at this totally smart aleck remark, the producer fired Harry on the spot. Harry would go on to sign a similar new talent program deal with Universal Studios, but again, he could not get a real part to save his life. And the feedback he finally got was, Harry, you're just not pretty enough, and you're not really that talented. By the mid-1970s, Harry was in his mid-30s, and while he still aspired to be an actor and wanted to be an actor, he was making almost no money from acting. And so he decided, instead of acting, he was going to become a carpenter. That was going to be his full-time job, despite the fact he knew nothing about carpentry. And so he literally, just because he has this interest in carpentry, goes to the library and checks out all these how to be a carpenter books. And over the next couple of weeks, he studies these books and does a couple projects around his own house. And then finally, he just felt confident enough, or he was just desperate enough for money, that he began going around to his network and asking people in Hollywood if they needed some woodworking, if they needed help from a carpenter. And surprisingly, lots of people took him up on his offer and they hired him to be their carpenter. And before long, Harry was dubbed the carpenter to the stars, which was kind of ironic because he actually was not a very good carpenter, and he was regularly seen on the job literally holding a book teaching him how to be a carpenter while doing the carpentry with his other hand. In 1976, Harry was a full-fledged carpenter and had been for about a year when one of his very close friends named Fred Roos, who was a casting director and film producer, gave him a call and told him he had a very unique opportunity for him. Now, at this point, Harry was not looking for any more acting roles. He kind of figured that that ship has sailed, even though he wishes he could be an actor. At this point, he had a wife, he had 2 sons, and so he's thinking, I gotta just keep doing this carpentry thing because I gotta pay the bills. So he says to Fred, you know, I appreciate the offer of whatever this is, but if it has to do with acting, you know, I'm just not interested. And Fred, who was one of the very few people in Hollywood who fundamentally believed Harry was destined to be a star, told Harry, no, this is different. This is not a pure go out and try out for the part and hope for the best. This is like, put yourself in a good position and maybe somebody will discover you're as talented as you really are. And so Harry's like, okay, tell me about this opportunity, you know, I'm interested. And so Fred explained there was this really talented and eccentric film director who was trying to cast an upcoming movie. And the way he went about casting for movies was a little bit strange. Instead of having each of the actors and actresses show up and individually audition for their parts, he would group batches of actors and actresses and he would have them audition as a group, because that way he could tell if there was chemistry amongst some of the actors and actresses, and he could gauge their individual talent. And so he had all these groups already planned out, but one of the groups was missing one male actor. Somebody had dropped out at the last minute and was not going to be there on the day of the audition. And so when Fred Roos heard through the grapevine that this director was going to be short this one person, he immediately reached out to the director and said, hey, I got your guy. There's this guy, Harry. He's done a little bit of acting. He's incredibly talented. You got to give him a chance. You know, at the minimum, he can come in there and he can at least just read the lines and help you do this audition. But I know he's available that day and I know he would love to help. And so this director tells Fred, okay, thank you. I'd love to have him come down, but stress to him, he is not auditioning for any part in this movie. I'm not bringing in some person and just throwing them in. It takes me a long time to find people that I want to audition, and he is not one of them. He is just there to facilitate the audition. He's just going to read the lines so the other people in his group can do their audition. And so after Fred stopped explaining this situation, Harry was actually kind of annoyed. He was annoyed that Fred had basically already volunteered him, and so he couldn't really even say no without making Fred look bad. And he didn't like the idea that this was basically a waste of his time. He was being asked to go read lines, but not even try out. So how was this even an opportunity? But Fred told him, look, worst case scenario, you meet some pretty powerful people in Hollywood. This director's a big deal. The people there are going to be big deals in Hollywood. So you'll meet them and maybe they will recognize your talent. Or maybe you get some new clients for your carpentry business. So no matter what, you get something out of it. And so finally, Harry says, okay, fine, I'll go do this thing. And so Harry goes to this audition, he's handed the script, and he's reminded repeatedly to not attempt to audition. Don't try to act, just read the lines. I don't care if you're monotone, you just read these lines because you're not auditioning. Everybody else is, you're not. Is that clear? And Harry's like, yes, I get it. I'm just reading the lines. And so Harry sits down and he starts reading the lines and he's trying to do what they told him to do, but the way he was actually feeling and his actual personality began seeping through. He started coming off as this really grumpy and sarcastic guy that just didn't care about anybody there. He was just totally bitter that he was in the situation he was in. And apparently, this is exactly what the director was looking for in one of the characters he was trying to cast. That kind of nonchalant, bravado, macho, alpha type guy who just didn't care about anybody. And so over the course of the day, as he's reading the script over and over again, not caring at all about how he's performing, he's just simply reading these lines and just being himself, he was actually doing this amazing job portraying one of the characters. And so they let Harry go the whole day. No one told him they were looking at him as a potential character. And then at the end of the day, when Harry was about to just throw the script in the trash and leave without talking to anyone, the film director, better known as George Lucas, walks up to Harry, better known as Harrison Ford, and says, wait a minute, I was wrong. You are perfect for this movie, Star Wars. You need to play Han Solo. And so Harrison Ford said, all right, I'll play Han Solo. And that role as Han Solo propelled Harrison Ford into the megastar that we know him as today. A few years after Harrison had starred in Star Wars and he was this total A-list celebrity, he was at a Hollywood studio in one of their restaurants when one of the waiters walked over to him with the silver tray, and on this silver tray was a single business card. So Harrison reaches over, he grabs the business card, the waiter walks away, and he looks at the card, and handwritten on it is the phrase, "I missed my bet." And he flipped the card over, and it was the name of that producer from the new talent program that had called Harry into his office and said, you're never going to make it in Hollywood and you're fired. It was that guy, and he had apparently sent the waiter over to make amends because he was eating lunch in the same restaurant. And so Harrison would later say in interviews that at the time he got this card, and to this day that he was doing this interview, he said it gave him immense pleasure that when he looked up from this business card and he understood the situation, he knows this guy's in the room somewhere, as he looked around the room, he couldn't recognize the guy because he didn't know what he looked like. He was a nobody. And so instead of wasting any more time looking for this producer, he just looked at the card, chucked it, and went back to eating his lunch. Michael Packard might be the luckiest or unluckiest person alive. In 2001, when Michael was 38 years old, he was on a flight over Costa Rica when the small plane he was on crashed. The pilot, co-pilot, and a passenger were all killed on impact, but Michael and the 4 other passengers, they survived the crash, but they were all left badly injured and stranded in a very remote section of the jungle. The survivors attempted to use the downed plane's radio equipment to send out a distress signal to try to get someone to come out and help them, but they had no way of knowing if anybody was receiving their signal. And so all they could do was just send it out and then wait and hope somebody found them before they all died. And sure enough, 48 hours after crashing, rescuers were able to hack their way deep into the jungle where Michael and the other survivors were, and they were all saved. While Michael was recovering in the hospital, a doctor told him that based on his injuries, he would not have survived another night out in that jungle. The chances of even being in a plane crash are astronomically low. The odds are about 1 in 5 million, with some places giving odds as low as 1 in 20 million. To put that in perspective, Michael was far more likely to have been struck by lightning, which is about a 1 in 1 million chance, than he was to have been in that plane crash. But that plane crash would not be the last time that Michael defied the odds and did something totally unbelievable. Over the next couple of decades, Michael, who was a commercial diver by trade, would survive not 1, but 2 significant encounters with great white sharks off the coast of California. Some of Michael's friends would not be so lucky. Michael would get lost at sea, like really lost, like treading out in the middle of the ocean with no land in sight for hours lost. but miraculously, a boat would find him and save him again. And Michael would discover the body of a long-time missing person hidden underneath the water about 60 feet down off the coast of Massachusetts. But of all the improbable exploits of Michael's life, none is more unbelievable than what happened to him in 2021, which experts are saying he had about a 1 in 1 trillion chance of experiencing. On the morning of June 11th, 2021, Michael, who was 57 years old at the time, hopped in a boat with his longtime diving partner, Josiah. Once they were all situated and they had all their equipment inside of the boat, they took off and headed for the open waters right off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where they planned to do some lobster diving. A popular way to retrieve lobsters is to literally just dive down and by hand pick them up and bring them back to the surface. And so that day, that's what Michael and Josiah planned to do. Once they reached this spot right off the coast, Michael put on all of his scuba diving equipment and hopped in the water. Josiah did not put on any diving equipment because he was not going to be getting in the water for this dive. Instead, he would remain on the boat and help Michael get in and out of the water. He'd pull lobsters up onto the boat, and he was also there in case of an emergency, he could call for help. And so just after 6 a.m., once Michael was in the water and signaled he was good to go, he dove down below, and after a little while, he came back up, but with a relatively small haul of lobsters. And so the two men figured that, well, I guess today is just not a great day for catching lobsters. But regardless, for the next couple of hours, Michael continued to go down and catch as many lobsters as he possibly could. By 8 a.m., Michael had captured approximately 100 pounds of lobsters that were now in the boat. And so Michael and Josiah were actually starting to feel pretty good about this particular trip. And so Michael decided he would go back down one more time and try to get just a few more lobsters before they called it a day. And so Josiah remembers watching Michael, who was in the water. As he put his mouthpiece back in, he signaled up to Josiah that he was good to go, and Josiah watched as he disappeared below the surface. And the water was very calm, and Josiah is just kind of scanning out across the water, and then all of a sudden this eruption of white water came rushing up to the surface right where Michael had gone down below. And so right away Josiah leaned out over the edge of the boat to see if he could look down and see his friend, but he didn't see Michael anywhere. Instead, he saw something massive moving around underneath them. After Michael had broken the surface on this final dive down to get more lobsters, his plan was to sink down to the bottom of the ocean at about 60 feet and then go hunting for lobsters. But when he had descended to about 45 feet, he felt something smash into him from behind that felt like a truck hitting him, and then everything around him went totally pitch black. The impact of whatever it was that hit him had caused his mouthpiece to get blown out of his mouth. So he doesn't have air, and he starts fumbling around to find his mouthpiece, but he can't find it. And as he's fumbling around, his hands are making contact with what feels like walls all around him. He was inside of an enclosed space. But when he had touched these walls, they were not normal walls. They were soft, but they were hard at the same time, and they seemed to be moving, like they were pulsating or quivering. The space he was in was fairly large, and it was not completely flooded with water. It was like Michael had slipped into this air pocket. But this air pocket was not stationary. It was moving, and pretty fast, because the water that was inside of it was violently sloshing all around. Michael could hear it slapping up against the walls. As Michael continued to panic and fumble around for his mouthpiece, he started to notice intense pressure on his legs, but he had no idea what was causing it, and because it's pitch black, he couldn't see what it was. Finally, Michael found the line that was connected to his mouthpiece. He jammed it in his mouth and he took a long inhale, and now that he could breathe again, he had this horrifying thought. Have I been swallowed by a shark? He instinctively began feeling around for the shark's teeth, but there were no teeth inside of this space. Instead, it was just these walls that continued to shift and move all around him. And that's when it dawned on him. He had been swallowed, but not by a shark. He had been swallowed by a whale. For nearly 45 seconds, Michael was trapped inside the closed mouth of a humpback whale. Despite their enormous size, they can be up to 60 feet long and weigh up to 70,000 pounds, they only eat small fish. So when this particular whale realized Michael was not a tiny fish, it began violently swinging its head side to side to try to dislodge Michael, and that caused that eruption of white water to go to the surface that Josiah saw. And after a few good shakes, Michael
Michael was spat out of this whale's mouth. Michael remembers suddenly being in the open water with enough light coming down that he could see around him. The water was very turbulent and churning, and he recalled as he made his way to the surface, looking straight down and seeing the tail fin of this enormous whale swimming away from him. Michael made his way to the surface and he flagged down Josiah, who boated over to him. He pulled him back into the boat, and Michael, who was totally traumatized by what happened, could only say to Josiah that he was inside of it and that it tried to eat him. After Josiah brought Michael back to shore and called the authorities, Michael was rushed to a hospital where he was evaluated, and unbelievably, he suffered really no injuries. He had some significant bruising to his legs where the whale had actually clamped down on him. That was the pressure he felt in his legs. The mouth of the whale was closing on his legs. But besides that, there really wasn't any other injuries. And so later that day, he was discharged. It's believed the whale was a juvenile that had been seen in the area that was about 30 to 35 feet long, and that had just accidentally scooped Michael up. The whale was certainly not trying to hurt Michael. Whales, especially humpback whales, are not in the business of hurting people. But in this exchange with Michael, Michael could have very easily died. He could have drowned or suffocated inside the mouth of this whale, or he could have just died from blunt force trauma. But luckily he didn't. Despite how terrifying this incident sounds, Michael was incredibly casual in all of his interviews about this. He just kind of acted like, these things kind of happen, whales come out of nowhere, they just scoop you up, it happens. And he would tell the incredulous reporters who just could not believe this guy was real that as soon as he was better, he was getting back in the water and going lobster diving.
On the evening of January 6th, 1982, a man named Harold Bray, who was a sheriff in Jefferson County, Colorado, which is an area just west of Denver, arrived at the Denver airport. Harold was running late because his commute into the airport had been treacherous because Denver and the surrounding areas were all getting pounded by a snowstorm. After running into the terminal and getting checked in and getting through security, he made it to his gate right as they were boarding the plane. Feeling very relieved, Harold joined the queue of other people that were getting on the ramp to go down into the plane, and then just a couple of minutes later, he stepped on board and he found his seat, which was located at the front right side of the plane. He sat down in his seat, he buckled in, and then he grabbed an in-flight magazine from the back pocket of the chair in front of him, and he waited for takeoff. 15 minutes later, as the plane was rumbling down the runway at full speed, Harold looked out the window. And so as the plane began to lift off the ground, he watched as the city lights of Denver slowly faded away as they got higher and higher up. But just before their plane entered into the thick cloud that was hovering over that stretch of Colorado, Harold noticed something very odd out of his window. Located just west of Jefferson County, which is where Harold worked, was a 22-mile stretch of road that cut through the Rocky Mountains. It was called the Guanella Pass, and it took motorists up and over this 11,000-foot mountain pass. Now, this was a beautiful scenic drive that Harold was very familiar with, but this road was not maintained in the wintertime. So if there was snow on the ground, you simply could not get through this pass. It was impossible. Yet, as Harold looked out of his plane window down to Jefferson County below, and he kind of scanned his way west up into the Rockies, he saw there were clearly a car's headlights on the Guanella Pass. And so Harold's thinking to himself, why in the world would anyone be on the Guanella Pass in the middle of this huge snowstorm? It didn't make any sense. But as Harold watched this vehicle, he saw what was going on. Whoever was in this vehicle was holding a flashlight out of their window, and they were shining the light straight up into the sky, flashing it on and off, signaling distress. This motorist was trapped. Harold knew the likelihood of another plane happening to fly over this area and looking down and seeing those lights and recognizing them for what they were, an emergency, were slim to none. So Harold knew if he didn't act quickly, this motorist was doomed. And so Harold quickly got up from his seat, he climbed over the person next to him, he got into the aisle, and he waved down the attendant, and then after the attendant ran over, Harold explained who he was and why his experience as a sheriff told him that this was an emergency. And so the attendant took him very seriously. They turned around, they went into the cockpit, and they told the pilots, and the pilots used their radios to call down to authorities on the ground. And then just a couple of minutes later, the fire department was dispatched to Guanella Pass. Pass. 15 minutes later, the fire chief, a man named Dave Montoya, who was driving in a four-wheel drive SUV, arrived at the start of this 22-mile stretch of Mountain Pass, and as they're driving through the whipping snow, he sees up ahead the headlights of the stranded vehicle. And so he drives right up alongside this vehicle, which was a small pickup truck that had clearly slid off the road and gotten stuck in a big snowbank. And so Dave, he parks his SUV, he hops out, and he rushes over to the driver's side window of this vehicle. And inside was a terrified-looking 30-year-old man named Alan Phillips, who was a mechanic who lived in the Denver area. Now, at the time, it was the middle of the night, it's negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit outside, the winds are whipping, the snow is coming down, and Alan only had on a light jacket and some jeans and a small blanket wrapped around him. So, had Harold not spotted his flashlight SOS signal from the plane, it's almost guaranteed that Alan would have died that night from hypothermia. And so when Alan turned and saw Dave standing there, his rescuer, Alan began crying tears of joy and thanking God that he was going to survive. When Dave asked Alan what happened, Alan, who was slightly intoxicated, told Dave that he had gone out drinking at a bar, and then when it was time to come home, he had stupidly decided to drive through the Guanella Pass back to his home, forgetting that this particular stretch of road was not maintained during the winter. When Dave asked Alan how he got this really deep bruise on his cheek, he assumed he got it from crashing off the side of the road, Alan smiled a kind of embarrassed smile and said, "No, actually, after I got stuck, I needed to urinate, and so I got out of the vehicle and I walked a few paces away from my truck and I went to the bathroom, and then when I turned to walk back, the snow was so blinding I couldn't actually see my truck, and I ran to go find it again because I didn't want to be trapped out in the snow, and I ran into the truck face first, and so my cheek hit the door of the truck." And so Dave, he just smiled and said, "Alan, you are one lucky man." Over the next few days, local newspapers in Colorado and some national newspapers ran headlines about the miracle at Guanella Pass. However, as it would turn out, that headline would not age well. 38 years later, in 2020, it was discovered that Alan had lied to Dave about why he was in Guanella Pass. The truth was, earlier in the evening that Alan would eventually get stuck, he had murdered two hitchhikers near Breckenridge, Colorado, roughly 50 miles from the Guanella Pass. Both of these murders had gone cold, but in late 2020, DNA evidence connected Alan to both cases. Several hours before Alan got rescued, he picked up 22-year-old Annette Schnee, who was hitchhiking, and after she got into his truck, it's believed he held her at gunpoint and then put zip tie handcuffs on her wrists, and then we don't really know what happened next, but at some point that night, Annette was taken out of the vehicle and led into the woods, and she was shot in the back, and she was left face down in a stream. A couple of hours after he killed Annette, Alan picked up another hitchhiker, 29-year-old Barbara Oberholzer, and when she got into his truck, it's believed he did the same thing. He held her at gunpoint and put her in zip tie handcuffs. However, Barbara was able to break out of her restraints. It's believed she struck Alan in the cheek, which is why he got that deep bruise on his cheek, and then she leapt out of his car and started running. But Alan got out, chased her down, and shot her in the chest, killing her, and then he dumped her body off the side of this cliff down into the snowbank below. So the only reason Alan got stuck in Guanella Pass is because he was attempting to flee the area where he committed these murders, and he likely just didn't understand how dangerous this pass was, and so shortly after turning onto it, his truck slid off the road and he got stuck. In February of 2021, Alan, who was 70 years old at the time and still living in the Denver area, was finally arrested for these two murders, and he is currently awaiting trial. Assuming he did it, that Alan killed these two women, we don't know what his motivations were. It's not clear, he hasn't said, and we also don't know if there are potentially other victims. Just after midnight on June 22nd, 1991, Charles Holden was on his way home from work when he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant near his house in Harrington, Delaware. After grabbing a quick bite to eat, Charles left the store and got back in his truck. He turned it on and he was about to drive out of the lot when he stopped because there was this man running towards him, waving, trying to flag him down. So Charles put his truck back in park and he rolled his window down to see what this guy wanted. And when this stranger got close enough, he told Charles that his sister was having a baby and he needed a ride to the hospital, which was about 20 minutes away. Charles couldn't tell if this guy was lying. It was super late. He didn't know this guy and he just had a bad feeling about him. And so he told him, "No, I'm sorry. It's too late. I gotta get home. It's too far out of the way." The stranger immediately looked dejected and turned around and started walking away. And as Charles was watching him go, he felt bad and said, "You know what? Hey, come back here. I'll give you a ride part of the way there." And so the stranger smiled, hopped in his passenger seat, and they took off. Charles drove him approximately 3 miles in the direction he had asked to go before pulling over on the side of the road and telling him, "This is as far as I'm going to take you." Charles lived only about a block away, and he didn't want to drive too far away from home so late at night. But the stranger, upon hearing he was being let out so soon, suddenly became angry and began fumbling in his pocket like he was going to get a knife or some sort of weapon, and he starts screaming at Charles, "Hand over your keys, hand over your wallet, or I'm going to kill you." Charles, meanwhile, was on edge, just being in the car with this guy because he had a bad feeling about him, and so he immediately jumped into action. He turned off his truck, he ripped the keys out of the ignition, and he leapt out of his truck and started running. Charles saw way off in the distance was a convenience store, and he figured he could run to there and get some help. But as he's running, he turns around and sees the stranger has also leapt out of the car and was now sprinting up to him with a screwdriver in his hand. And this stranger was running really fast. He was gaining on Charles, and soon Charles realized he wasn't going to make it to the convenience store before this guy caught up to him. And so at some point, Charles just stops, he turns around and he puts his hands up and he says, okay, I'll give you a ride wherever you want to go, and then you can have my keys, my wallet, you can have anything you want. And so the stranger runs right up to Charles and he stops and he smiles because he's very pleased with this result. And he pokes him with the screwdriver and kind of gestures for him to go back to the truck. So Charles walks back to the truck with the stranger right behind him with the screwdriver periodically poking him in the back. They finally get to the vehicle and the stranger tells Charles to get in the car and then wait. But as soon as Charles sat down, he fired up his truck and sped off before the stranger could hop in the passenger side door. And so Charles is flying away from this guy. He looks in his rear view mirror and he can see the guy is chasing after him with a screwdriver held over his head, but he sees the stranger at some point just stops, turns around and walks away. Charles was totally relieved that he had escaped this horrible encounter, and he was thinking about calling the police, but ultimately decided he wouldn't because it was his decision to allow some stranger to get in his car in the middle of the night. And so Charles kind of blamed himself for the whole ordeal. What Charles was concerned about, though, was where he had ditched the stranger was not far from his house, and he was worried if he just turned around and drove right back to his house that this guy could recognize the truck and then follow him to his house, and then who knows what could happen. And so Charles decides he's just going to stay outside of town and drive around for a while to make sure this stranger is long gone by the time he comes back. So after about an hour of doing just that, driving around outside of town, Charles goes back into Harrington, Delaware, and he gets on his street, and he's shocked when he sees the stranger who had just tried to kill him is walking down the road right in front of him. But luckily, the stranger did not hear or see Charles pull onto his street, and so Charles immediately throws it in reverse and he gets out of there and he drives off. At this point, Charles decides he needs to tell police because he doesn't know if this stranger actually knows him and that maybe he's targeting him and he's waiting for him at his property. And so he calls 911 and he tells the dispatcher about what had happened earlier and how this guy is now lurking around his property. And the dispatcher tells him they'll send an officer out to him. And so a few minutes later, an officer showed up at the payphone where Charles was, and they told Charles they would escort him back to his property. And if the stranger was still out in the area, they would arrest him. And so the two of them made their way back to Charles's property. They get there, the stranger's long gone, and then Charles goes into his house. There's no sign of a break-in. There's no sign that anyone was near his property. And so Charles thanks the officer. He feels totally relieved. But before the officer leaves, he asks him if he wouldn't mind doing a quick sweep of his mother's property. She lived right behind Charles on the other side of some bushes. He told the officer her name was Dorothy. She was 70 years old and she lived alone, and he just wanted to make sure nothing happened to her. So the officer said, no problem, I'll go check in on her. So the officer leaves Charles and goes across his backyard through those bushes into Dorothy's backyard, and right away he can see the back window on the back door has been smashed and the door itself is slightly ajar. And so the officer draws their pistol and they go up and they enter the house and they look inside, they're yelling for Dorothy, but there's no answer. It's totally dark in the house, it's totally silent. And so after searching the first floor and finding nothing, they make their way up the flight of stairs and they find blood at the top of the landing. And they follow this trail of blood and it brings them into one of the bedrooms where a woman is sprawled out on a bed. It was Dorothy. She had been stabbed to death. It would turn out, after Charles had ditched the stranger and sped off without him, the stranger, whose name was Gilbert Cannon, began looking for a place to sleep, and the house he ultimately selected just happened to be Charles's mother's house. After Gilbert broke in through her back door, he saw Dorothy coming down the steps to confront him, and because he was worried she'd be able to identify him, he attacked her with a screwdriver. Gilbert would later tell police that the attack on Charles was completely random. He was just at this fast food restaurant, he saw Charles get into his truck, and he thought to himself, if I can get in that guy's truck, I bet I can rob him. And then after this failed robbery, when Gilbert is out looking for a place to sleep and he breaks into this house and this woman comes down the stairs that he attacks and kills, he has no idea that this woman, Dorothy, is Charles's mother. The entire night was one big horrible coincidence. Gilbert would plead guilty to the murder and would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please change the like button's default internet browser to Microsoft Edge. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 2019, Meg Moorer was a 21-year-old senior at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. She was studying ecology and evolutionary biology and planned to pursue a career in scientific illustration after graduation. This was a field that combined her skill as a scientist, her incredible artistic ability, and her general love of nature. But despite her intellectual brilliance, what Meg was actually known for was her very uplifting personality. When her mother was asked what her daughter was like, she said, well, it's like trying to describe what it's like to feel the warmth of the sun. There are not words to accurately describe what that feels like. And that was Meg. She was radiant, she was joyous, she was adventuresome, she was kind, she was really just a wonderful person to be around. In March of that year, just 2 months before their graduation, Meg and 2 of her close friends decided to go on a trip for spring break. This would be their last spring break as students, and they wanted to enjoy it. Because they were all in excellent physical condition, they decided they would spend the week hiking in Georgia. When Meg told her family about her big plans, they could tell she was extremely excited, and they just told her, be safe and we'll see you when you get back. On the morning of their departure, which was March 5th, Meg packed her suitcase into the trunk of her small green sedan, and then she drove over to her 2 friends' apartment building, and they came out and they put their suitcases into the car, and then once the car was all packed and all 3 of them were inside, they hit the road. The drive from Tulane University to this area in Georgia where they'd be hiking took about 8 hours if you didn't stop. But none of them were in a particularly big rush, and so they figured they would just stop along the way, and if they got to Georgia super late at night, so be it. After being on the road for 2 hours without stopping, they all needed to use the bathroom, and so Meg decided to pull over at the first rest stop she saw. And the first one she saw was in this residential town in Mississippi called Gaucher. So she pulls off the highway into this very nondescript rest stop, and all 3 of them get out. They go into the main building and they use the restroom. Meg was the first one to be done, so she came outside and she waited right near the bathroom door, and then her 2 friends, they finished up as well. They came out, and then the trio began walking back towards the parking lot where Meg's car was. At the same time, a man driving an 18-wheeler tractor-trailer truck was bombing down the highway right outside of this rest stop, and right before he was going to pass the area where this rest stop was, he heard something fall off the back of his truck. He instinctively checked both of his mirrors to see if maybe he could see what had fallen off, but he didn't see anything in the road, and so he just pulled over onto the shoulder and got out to see what was going on. When he walked towards the back of his truck, he expected to see, maybe one of the back doors had popped open or something like that. But even before he made it to the back of his truck and could even look at those back doors, he already knew what had fallen off the truck. 2 of his back tires were just gone. This truck had what's called dual rear wheels, which meant on the axle there was not just one wheel on each side. Instead, there were 2 wheels on each side, so 4 wheels across one axle. And so each of these 2 wheels were bolted together and would turn at the same time and kind of functioned like one big fat tire. This gave the truck more stability and safety when it was towing. The driver, in a panic, looked back down the road in the direction he had just come, hoping to just see the tires somewhere, but they weren't anywhere to be found. And so, not really knowing what to do, he just instinctively called his boss and told him what was going on. And his boss just said, "Hold tight, I will send help out to you." And so this driver is left to just stand on the side of the road and wait for help to arrive. And so as he's doing that, he's just staring back down the road in the direction he had just come, as if these tires are just going to magically appear. And as he's looking in this direction, he starts to notice on the other side of the highway, there are police cars and ambulances streaming into a rest stop that he had just passed. And it was the rest stop where Meg and her 2 friends had been. It would turn out when these 2 tires became dislodged from this truck, they went careening across the highway to the other side, across oncoming traffic, all the way up into this rest stop, and they crashed directly into Meg right as she was climbing back into her car. These 2 tires combined weighed almost 1,000 pounds, and so the impact killed Meg. She was pronounced dead on the scene. After an investigation, it was not conclusively determined what actually caused these tires to fall off. The likely cause was they were missing a small part known as a locking washer that costs $3 and is very easy to acquire. But regardless, at this point, the incident is considered a freak accident. In January of 1997, a very accomplished and Ivy League trained American chemist named Karen Wetterhahn started experiencing tingling in her lower extremities. Now, it was uncomfortable, but it wasn't enough discomfort to warrant going to a doctor or really being concerned about it. She figured it was just something kind of minor and it would go away on its own. But shortly after this tingling began, Karen started noticing she was having balance issues. She would be walking down the hallway at the university where she worked when inexplicably she would just lose her balance and start stumbling and would either fall to the ground or would have to lean up against the wall to steady herself. She tried to convince herself that she was just being clumsy or that she was just really tired and that's what was causing it. But shortly after these balance issues presented themselves, Karen was hit with a host of other health issues. Her speech became awkwardly slow and slurred. She began hearing this white noise ringing in her ear that just wouldn't go away. And her field of vision drastically narrowed to the point where it was like she was looking through 2 toilet paper rolls. Karen's husband brought her to the hospital where she underwent this very lengthy and involved examination, which involved spinal taps and brain scans to try to figure out what was going on, because at first, none of the doctors had any idea. After the testing was complete and Karen was sleeping in a hospital bed and her husband was sitting by her side, a doctor walked into the room with a clipboard and he had this odd look on his face, like the news he was about to deliver he didn't really even understand. And so he consulted his clipboard one more time, looking at some paperwork, and then he looked up and he looked at Karen, and then he turned to Karen's husband and he just says to him, "Sir, does your wife have any enemies?" It would turn out Karen was suffering from a severe case of mercury toxicity. Mercury is a naturally occurring metallic element that is poisonous to humans in all its forms. And Karen had so much mercury in her body, in fact she had 80 times the toxic threshold, that doctors believed this had to have been an intentional poisoning, that someone must have attacked Karen trying to kill her with mercury. But Karen's husband said, "I don't think my wife has any enemies. enemies. And then when Karen ultimately woke up, she reiterated that sentiment, that she did not have any enemies. The doctors, who knew Karen was a chemist, they asked her, have you had any recent exposure to mercury? And through slurred and difficult to understand speech, Karen would say that she had. In fact, over the last 6 months leading up to this hospital visit, Karen had had lots of exposure to mercury because she was actually in charge of this huge $7 million research project that was looking to investigate the effects certain metals had on human health. And one of the metals she was studying was mercury. But Karen assured the doctor that anytime she handled any of these metals, she was always very, very cautious, especially when she handled mercury because she understood how hazardous it was. She said she always wore the proper protective equipment to make sure none of the substances made contact with her skin, and she worked under this big chemical hood, which is like a big vacuum, to ensure she didn't accidentally inhale any of the toxic fumes that came off of these metals. The doctor was totally stumped and went silent for a second, and then Karen at some point broke the silence by saying, well, there was one time I did have a spill with mercury, but it was totally meaningless, and I haven't thought about it until just now, only because we're trying to figure out what happened. She would go on to tell the doctor about an incident that occurred 5 months earlier. She had been working at her lab at the university where she was employed when she accidentally spilled 1 or 2 tiny droplets of mercury onto the top of her left hand near her thumb. Now, she was wearing all of the prescribed protective equipment, including latex gloves on her hand, and so when she saw these droplets on her hand, she wasn't concerned for her health. She just followed procedure. She stopped what she was doing, she wiped the droplets off, and then she left her workstation, she threw away the contaminated gloves, she thoroughly washed her hands, and then put new gloves on, and then just went back to work and didn't think much of it. The type of mercury that Karen had spilled on her hand was called dimethyl mercury. This is not the same thing as the shiny silver liquid we see in old thermometers. That is a hazardous substance, but it's nothing compared to dimethyl mercury. Dimethyl mercury is a clear liquid that is considered to be one of the most toxic substances on the planet. After hearing this story from Karen, the doctor agreed that overall this did seem like a kind of meaningless event because she had followed all the proper procedures and those droplets had landed on her gloves, not on her skin. But since they had no other leads to operate on, he thought it would still be a good idea to test to see if dimethyl mercury could penetrate through latex. And sure enough, after they ran some studies, they found it could. In fact, the latex gloves that all these scientists were told to wear when handling this particular substance, they did nothing. The dimethyl mercury would penetrate through the latex in seconds. But even though they had just solved the mystery of how Karen got mercury toxicity in the first place, what no one could understand was why Karen was still suffering from the effects of mercury toxicity if her only exposure to it was 5 months earlier, just that one time. Typically, people who have mercury toxicity, they will get better as soon as the source of their toxicity is removed. Meaning, when the mercury goes away, they get better. And it's because the mercury kind of pools in their bloodstream and their body will naturally excrete it and they'll get better. But unfortunately for Karen, it would turn out dimethyl mercury is a little bit different. It's far more lipophilic than other types of mercury. Lipophilic means a chemical substance is more likely to bind and mix with fat tissue in the body. And since blood is primarily made of water, when dimethyl mercury enters the body, it does not settle in the bloodstream. Instead, it settles in organs that are made up of primarily fat. And once dimethyl mercury is in your organs, it takes an exponentially longer amount of time for your body to excrete it, if it ever does. Sometimes you just die from the effects of mercury toxicity before your body can get rid of it. And in Karen's case, when she showed up to the hospital, it was already too late. Some of the dimethyl mercury had already made its way up to her brain, which is an organ made up of 60% fat, and there it began to destroy her central nervous system. 3 weeks after being admitted to the hospital, Karen fell into a coma, and then shortly after, one of Karen's friends was in the hospital visiting her, and she saw a tear was coming down Karen's face. And so the friend turned to the doctor and said, is she in pain? Is that why she's crying? And the doctor said, no, it doesn't appear her brain is able to register pain anymore. Karen would unfortunately never wake up from her coma. She would pass away on June 8th, 1997, roughly 10 months after those little droplets of dimethyl mercury landed on her latex glove. In the 1850s and 1860s, Edwin Booth was the man. He was this extremely famous American actor who basically anywhere he went in America, people would know who he was. He was extremely recognizable, a household name, an A-list celebrity through and through. But his acting prowess and his career and his fame, those are not the things we remember him for. In early 1865, when Edwin was 31 years old and was at the height of his acting fame, he walked into a New Jersey train station and walked through the building to the actual platform where the trains are. And as soon as he turned a corner and actually saw the train that he wanted to board, he very quickly realized that he probably was not going to get on that train. There was already this huge throng of people out on the platform pressed up against the side of this train, and they're all waving their arms around and yelling. And in the middle of this big group of people with his back pressed up against the train was the train's conductor, whose job was to sell tickets in addition to driving the train. But from Edwin's perspective, it seemed fairly obvious based on the conductor's body language and what some of the people in the crowd were yelling that there just weren't enough tickets. That's why this big unruly group had formed, because all these people were rushing forward trying to buy one of the last few tickets. Now, Edwin could have very easily just walked up and announced himself and shown his very famous face, and almost certainly he would have gotten a ticket. But to this point, Edwin had not been recognized in this train station, and so he wanted to keep a low profile, and so he decided against that idea. Instead, he decided he would just kind of join this big group and, try to flag down the conductor and try to buy one of these tickets, and if he didn't, so be it. And so Edwin, instead of going to the back of this group, he went around to the right side, close up against the side of the train, and right as he got to the outside of the group and he turned in towards the group, he looked up at where the conductor was, and he saw the conductor turning around and walking back into the train. He had clearly sold all of his tickets, and so anyone who had not purchased one yet, like Edwin, they were out of luck. They'd have to wait for the next train. Edwin was about to just walk away and wait for the next train when he noticed the crowd in front of him. They didn't disperse like he was doing. Instead, they all seemed to kind of surge forward towards the train, which was now moving, and as they pushed forward as if they were going to jump onto this train even though they didn't have tickets, one man who was towards the front of this group, right up against the train, he falls to the ground and gets trapped halfway under the train. His lower half was literally on the tracks under the train, and his upper half is now under this big crowd of people that are now trampling him. And so Edwin can see very clearly that if someone does not grab this guy and pull him out soon, he's gonna get run over by the train. And so Edwin, without any hesitation, he jumps forward onto the ground on the platform, and he reaches his hand out through the feet of all these people in this crowd, and he grabs the collar of the guy who had fallen, and he pulls him. And as he's pulling him, this guy who's on his back, he starts pushing with his legs and his feet, and within about a fraction of a second, they yank him out from under the train, and the guy who had fallen and Edwin are lying on their backs on the platform. And before they could even talk to each other, they sat up and watched as a big train wheel rolled over that piece of track where this guy had just been laying. Edwin had saved his life. The guy he had saved was a 21-year-old named Robert, and so the two of them, they stand up and they face each other for the first time, and when Robert sees Edwin, he gasps, because this is Edwin Booth, the mega celebrity. He could not believe that was the guy who had just saved him. And while Robert was very thankful, he also was just totally dumbfounded at the absurdity of the situation he was in. And so eventually Edwin just says, hey, I'm glad I was here to help you, no big deal, next time be more careful. And then at some point the men just shook hands and parted ways. Edwin would eventually get on the next train and he would go wherever it was he needed to go. And before long, his very busy schedule kind of occupied his mind and he had kind of forgotten about what happened on the train platform. But a few days later, Edwin got a letter in the mail from a very high-ranking government official thanking him for saving Robert's life, because it would turn out Robert Lincoln was the eldest son of the then President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Now, to be clear, Edwin was extremely famous and had lots and lots of influence and knew lots of very important people, but he had never had any interaction with anyone in the Lincoln family before he met Robert on the train platform. So it was just a crazy coincidence that this mega celebrity happened to save the life of the president's son. But this coincidence was nothing compared to the coincidence that occurred next. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, so roughly 3 months after Edwin saved Robert, Robert's father, President Lincoln, sat down in a private seating area to watch a play at a Washington, D.C. theater. During the production, at around 10:15 p.m., a man snuck into the private seating area and shot the president to death. The killer was Edwin's younger brother, John Wilkes Booth. This assassination had nothing to do with Edwin or his interaction with Robert on the train platform. This was an assassination that was formulated and carried out completely independently, meaning it was purely coincidence that just a few months after Edwin saved a Lincoln's life, his own brother took a Lincoln's life. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comment section what it is and where you found it. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please replace the like button's default internet browser with Microsoft Edge. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and mugs and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions in our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's johnballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page called MrBallen where we post condensed versions of the videos you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I will share the photo or photos that are famously associated with them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to house sit for the like button, and while you're there, split all of their 2-ply toilet paper into 1-ply. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1992, 41-year-old Marvin Heemeyer purchased a plot of land in the small town of Granby, Colorado. There, for the next decade, he would run a muffler shop. Then, in the early 2000s, a cement company approached him and asked if they could buy a portion of his land so they could build a plant. And at first, Marvin was not really interested in the idea, but the cement company was offering a lot of money. And so Marvin came around to the idea, and after a long negotiation, Marvin and this company were about to sign a contract when Granby's zoning commission informed the cement company they didn't need to buy Marvin's property in order to build this plant. They could actually build it right next to Marvin's property. The cement company was thrilled. Marvin was furious. Not only was he losing a ton of money with this deal falling through, but also he used to use that plot of land that sat next to his property as a cut through between his house and his muffler shop. Marvin immediately began petitioning the town to try to stop the construction of this plant, but he was repeatedly rejected. And within a year, the plant was built right next to Marvin's property. A couple of years later, on the afternoon of June 4th, 2004, Granby residents heard a very loud sound that almost sounded like thunder coming from somewhere in the town. And so they ran outside to see what it was. When they looked down the road, they saw it. It was a fully armored bulldozer coming right down the center of town. The sides, the top, the back, the front, the whole thing was completely encased in steel sheets. And in some parts, the steel was over a foot thick. Traveling at 4 miles an hour, its treads were enormous, and as it went over the road, it was taking huge bites out of the ground. There was no way to tell who was actually driving this bulldozer because there were no windows. And in fact, the person who was in there had welded themselves inside, and they had installed cameras on the outside so they could see where they were going. Terrified residents ran for cover and began calling 911. Over the next 2 hours, this homemade assault vehicle would go on a rampage, destroying 13 buildings, starting with the cement plant. After that, it turned around and went straight through the town hall, it turned and went through a bank, and then it went through the police station, and then the local newspaper, and then it also went through a local hardware store and the house of the former mayor. The police tried to box the bulldozer in using their biggest vehicles, but it just easily pushed them aside. SWAT team showed up and began engaging this vehicle with their largest caliber armor-piercing rounds, but none of them went through it. Finally, one of the treads on the bulldozer got stuck in a basement, and it kind of tilted the machine on its side, and it couldn't go anywhere. And then very shortly after that, the engine finally died. It would take authorities 7 hours to finally cut through the armor of this killdozer. And when they looked inside, they found that Marvin was the one driving it, and he had taken his own life. Marvin had spent the past year and a half building up this bulldozer specifically so he could seek revenge on the zoning committee as well as other town officials that he felt screwed him. Marvin was the only fatality, but before he died, he caused over $7 million in damages. Here are some real images of Marvin's killdozer. On the evening of December 19th, 2016, 62-year-old Russian ambassador Andrei Karlov was ushered into a famous art museum in Turkey. There, Andrei was going to deliver a speech at the opening of an exhibition of Turkish photography that featured the Russian countryside. Andrei had been a Russian government employee for the past 40 years, spending much of his time in North Korea, but in 2013 he took this post as the ambassador to Turkey. Although he was a seasoned diplomat, he knew there was a lot riding on this visit. His appearance there was following several days of protests by Turks against Russian involvement in the Syrian civil war. Andrei was there to ease the strain in Turkish-Russian relations as officials from both countries met to broker a ceasefire in Syria. As Andrei made his way across the room, he had a lot of things on his mind, but one thing he wasn't concerned about was his own safety. The museum had state-of-the-art security cameras, and everyone who was going to be attending his speech had been carefully screened and vetted. Andrei was also protected by his own personal bodyguards that were these men in dark suits that fanned out around him as he stepped up to the microphone. The bodyguard who stood directly behind him was 22-year-old Melvit Altuntaş. He was a Turkish native who for 2.5 years had served on an elite riot police unit, and over the past year, he had been asked 8 separate times to be on the personal security detail of the Turkish president. Andrei looked down at the podium at his notes, and then he looked up at the room that was filled with journalists and dignitaries, and he composed himself, he cleared his voice, and he began to speak. Behind him, Mevlut, the bodyguard, opened his jacket slightly and continued staring at the back of Andrei's head. And then in one swift motion, he drew a pistol and fired 3 shots into the ambassador's back. And then when the ambassador fell to the ground, Mevlut moved on top of him and fired 4 more shots, killing him. Guests started screaming and running for cover. Meanwhile, Mevlut pointed his finger into the sky and yelled, "Do not forget Aleppo, do not forget Syria." And then he began walking around the exhibit, smashing the pictures on the wall before Turkish security forces showed up. There was a gunfight and Mevlut was killed. It would turn out Mevlut was not a part of Andrei Karlov's security detail. He was actually off duty, but had used his police credentials to get into the exhibit hall. His exact motive for the assassination is unclear. Some think it was revenge for Russia's targeting of rebel-held areas in Aleppo. Others say the shooting was designed to disrupt warming relations between Turkey and Russia. But regardless of why it happened, what the world remembers from this event is the award-winning photograph that was taken of Mevlut immediately after he committed the attack. Here is that photo. In the fall of 2015, 21-year-old Otto Warmbier was a gifted student at the University of Virginia. He had a passion for seeing new and faraway places, and so one day when he was on campus and he saw an ad for a trip going to one of the most secretive places in the world, North Korea, he jumped at the opportunity to go. The tour was being run by a group called the Young Pioneers, whose slogan was, "We take you to places that your mother would rather you stayed away from." But they promised their tours were totally safe. Initially, Otto's parents were not too keen keen on the idea of their son going to North Korea, but when they saw how excited he was about going on this trip, they ultimately said, okay, we'll let you go. On December 29th, 2015, Otto met up with the other 10 members of this tour group at the airport. They all climbed inside of an old Soviet jet, and they took off for North Korea. 15 hours later, they arrived at Pyongyang International Airport, and as soon as they got off the plane, the North Korean border police came right up to them, confiscated their cameras, and then checked their phones for any subversive material. After a few tense minutes, they gave them their phones back and allowed them to leave. The group went straight to their hotel, and before they went inside, they noticed a clearly anti-American billboard right outside, and it made the group very uneasy because they were all American. But they collectively decided that this was just part of the experience and they shouldn't be worried or concerned about it. And before long, they had totally let their guard down and they were out enjoying the sights and sounds of the capital city. At one point, Otto and some others even got into a snowball fight with some North Korean children. By New Year's Eve, the group felt completely normal walking around North Korea, and so they headed to this huge party at Kim Il-sung Square with thousands of other North Koreans. And then after that was over, they headed back to their hotel and continued to drink. The hotel they were staying in was designed to entertain foreigners. In addition to their bar and 5 restaurants in the lobby, they had a massage parlor, a sauna, a bowling alley. I mean, this group was totally living it up. The following morning, which was the day of their departure from North Korea, Otto was one of the last people of the group to hand his passport to airport officials. And when he did, it seemed like they spent a lot of time looking at it and then looking at Otto and then talking to each other in Korean. And then at some point, 2 North Korean soldiers just appeared out of nowhere behind Otto, tapped him on the shoulder. Otto turned around and they grabbed him by the arm and led him away. The others from the group that saw this happen would say Otto didn't put up any resistance and didn't look scared. He just walked with them. Later, North Korea would release grainy CCTV footage taken from inside the hotel where Otto and the group was staying that showed this unidentifiable figure walking into a restricted area, pulling a poster off of the wall. And the North Koreans were saying that figure was Otto. After taking Otto from the airport, North Korean officials said they found the poster that had been stolen in Otto's possession, and they accused him of a very serious crime in North Korea, which is damaging or stealing any item that has the picture or name of the North Korean leader on it. Otto was sent to jail and the rest of his group was told to leave. 2 months later, on February 29th, the North Korean government released a video that showed Otto walking into a North Korean courtroom. His head is down and his hands are cuffed. They walk him into the center of the room and sit him down in front of this long table, and he's looking out to the sea of reporters and courtroom officials, and he proceeds to confess to his crime. The way he describes what he did is so bizarre that many people believe it was a forced confession scripted by his interrogators. Otto says he put on his quietest boots, the best for sneaking, and then snuck his way into the hotel where he stole the poster. He claimed a local Methodist church, a university's secret society, and the American administration all collectively pushed him to do this. He said his actions were intentionally designed to hurt the work ethic and motivation of the Korean people. And he also said he was impressed with the North Korean government's humanitarian treatment of himself, considering he was a severe criminal. And then after his nearly 2-minute long confession, he stands up and bows to the court and then appears to break character and begs for forgiveness, and he's quickly ushered out. A month later, the North Korean court would convict Otto and sentence him to 15 years of hard labor. But after 17 months of intense political pressure, North Korea agreed to release Otto and send him back to the United States. Now, to this point, nobody had had a chance to communicate with Otto while he was in prison. And so when he was sent back, he was not the same Otto. He had suffered some unexplained head injury and was in a coma. When Otto's parents saw him for the first time, they barely recognized him. They said it looked like his lower teeth had been moved around with pliers, and they found a large scar on his foot that they didn't recognize. North Korea denied any intentional mistreatment of Otto. They said he fell into this coma after contracting botulism, which is a very rare form of food poisoning that can be deadly. Once Otto was back under American medical care, doctors did everything they could to try to get him out of this coma, but there was nothing they could do. He was in a persistent vegetative state, and he had already suffered severe brain damage. And so on June 19th, 2017, just 6 days after Otto was back in the United States, his parents made the heartbreaking decision to remove him from life support, and he died shortly thereafter. To this day, no one really knows what actually happened to Otto. Here is one of the final photos of Otto while he was still alive and healthy, taken right after his strange confession. He's holding back tears and begging for mercy, but mercy would not come. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer to house sit for the like button. And when you're there, split all of their 2-ply toilet paper into 1-ply. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. If you Google the craziest war story of all time, the story I'm going to tell today always pops up as the #1. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please remove all of the trash bags from inside all of the like button's trash cans and then proceed to throw away various perishable saucy food items. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Born in South Texas in 1935, Roy Benavidez was orphaned as a young child and sent to live with his uncle. As a young teen, he had to drop out of school to work in the beet and cotton fields just to help support his family. When he turned 18, he decided he wanted to get away from his hometown and do something bigger with his life, and so he enlisted in the Army, and shortly after that, he went to airborne school and then was assigned to the very famous 82nd Airborne Division. In October of 1964, Roy was a part of the first 125,000 Americans sent to Vietnam. While on a classified operation that required Roy to dress up as an enemy combatant, he stepped on a landmine in the middle of the jungle and nobody else was with him, so he's totally stranded. But fortunately, a squad of US Marines came upon him, but from what he was wearing, they assumed he was an enemy soldier, and so they almost walked past him, but someone thought to just flip him over and see who he was, and they discovered he was American, and he had American dog tags on. And so he was evacuated from Vietnam and sent to an American hospital, and there, a doctor would tell him that he had a serious spinal injury and that it was unlikely he would ever walk again. And Roy's first reaction was, please don't discharge me from the Army. Because for Roy, the Army was his life. It was all he had. He was incredibly proud of it. And he desperately wanted to go back to Vietnam. And so he pleaded with the doctors and the nurses, please let me have some time to try to regain my strength in my legs so that I don't get medically discharged. And so they said, look, you're gonna get medically retired if you aren't walking within the year. And so every night when his doctors and nurses would leave, he would fall out of his bed and then drag himself across the ground to the wall, and then he'd pull himself up and try to put weight on his legs and attempt to build strength back up and retrain himself how to walk. And after 6 months of doing this every night, he did literally reteach himself how to walk. He built up strength in his legs, and his doctors and nurses, they're watching this transformation during the day, but they're not seeing him at night, and they're telling him, this is a miracle. We've never seen this before. We've never seen someone recover so quickly. And Roy just stayed quiet because he wanted to make sure he was allowed to keep doing that every night. And so finally, after those 6 months, his doctors and nurses agreed that, yep, he's good. He can stay in the Army. But the Army said they wanted him to take a desk job because he had already been so badly wounded in combat. And Roy didn't want that. He pleaded with them to let him go back to the 82nd, but they said, no, we're not going to risk you getting hurt again. And so he was sent to North Carolina for his desk job. And as soon as he got there, he began training like a maniac every minute of every day, trying to get in the best shape of his life, because his plan in his head was once he got there, he would try out for Special Forces. He would try to become an Army Green Beret, which is the premier combat unit in the Army. It's one of the hardest ones to get into, and their training program is in North Carolina. And so after a few months, he was in amazing shape, and he asked his superiors, can I go try out to be a Green Beret? And they're like, I can't believe you're even walking, but you know what? You've come this far, you can go try out. And just a couple of months later, Roy Benavidez was a Green Beret. A year later, in 1968, so 4 years after Roy was nearly killed by that landmine, he was sent back to Vietnam for his second combat tour. And as soon as he got there, the fighting was very intense. On May 2nd of that year, Roy had a day off, and he was spending his day off at a church service inside of their wooden shack they had built on their base. And while he was in there listening to the chaplain, he heard a radio call come out from the communications table that was just outside of the shack he was in, and it sounded like someone was in trouble. And so he ran outside to listen to the radio, and what he heard was this very desperate call from someone yelling into the radio, "Get us out of here." And in the background of this radio call is just a constant barrage of gunfire. The call for help came from a 12-man Army Special Forces team that had been ambushed by an entire North Vietnamese Army infantry battalion. To put that in perspective, that is 12 Special Forces members, of which many of them Roy knew personally, in the middle of the jungle, where on all four sides there are over 1,000 enemy combatants. As Roy is hearing this distressing transmission come across the radio, he hears overhead the sound of incoming helicopters. And he looks and he sees there's 3 birds that are coming towards their base. And so he runs over to the landing zone to greet the helicopters as they come in. And he can see as they're landing, they are all completely covered in bullet holes. And as soon as they touch down, Roy runs up to one of the door gunners, which is this 19-year-old kid. And he looks kind of dazed. And Roy asks him, what's going on? Where'd you guys just come from? Were you out there at that ambush site? Do you know what's going on with that 12-man team? And the door gunner just collapses into Roy's arms and dies. He had been shot up. These 3 helicopters had attempted previously to fly into the jungle and save that 12-man team, but they had been shot off and had been unsuccessful. Roy helped get the dead door gunner out of the helo, and then he turned to the pilot of this helo where the door gunner was, and he asked him, are you going to go back out there and try to save those guys? And the pilot was obviously so distraught about the death of his door gunner, and also the fact that there are 12 men out there that they could not rescue, that he's chomping at the bit. He wants to go back out there. And Roy immediately volunteers, hops in the helo, and they head out to go rescue this 12-man team. So not only are there only 2 of them, but Roy was so eager to volunteer himself, he forgot his gun. So all he had on him was his knife and some medical supplies. But nonetheless, the pilot just keeps flying towards the ambush site, which was in Cambodia. It was this really dense stretch of jungle. And as they got closer and closer, gunfire started coming out of the jungle towards the helicopter. And so the pilot had to do this kind of constant zigzagging just to avoid getting shot down. And so as they're zigzagging, they notice there's some smoke coming out of the jungle. And it was very clear that this 12-man team is trying to signal to the helo, here we are, come get us, because they can hear the helicopters coming in. And so the pilot tried to fly down and get as close as he could, but anytime he got even marginally close to this team, the rate of fire would pick up so dramatically that the helo was just about to get shot down. And so the pilot began to turn away, and he told Roy, we can't get any closer. We're going to have to get more people in here. And Roy just tells him, no. Get as low as you can, and I will jump out into the jungle. And the pilot turns to him and he's like, you can't do that. You're going to get killed. And Roy somehow convinces this pilot that he alone, without a gun, is totally competent. Just put me down in that jungle and everything's going to be just fine. And so the pilot said, okay, and he lowered right over the canopy of this jungle, about 100 yards away from where this 12-man team is trapped. And without any hesitation, Roy just leaps off the helicopter into the jungle. Now, you got to understand that where he was jumping was where the enemy was. He was literally jumping, no parachute, no gun, no anything, just crashing through the canopy onto the jungle floor where he'll definitely be surrounded by enemy combatants. And so he plummets through the canopy, he smashes onto the ground, he pops up and just starts running through the jungle with enemies on either side of him towards the 12-man down team. And the enemy was so surprised to just see this American running through the middle of the jungle by himself with no weapon that they hesitated for a minute and they didn't open fire on him. But when they did open fire, Roy got shot in the face, in the back of the head, in the leg. They threw a grenade that detonated at his back and sent shrapnel into him, but none of it stopped Roy. He just kept on running until he made it to this downed 12-man team. And when he got to them, they were in terrible shape. They were doing their best to stay behind some trees, but rounds were coming in from all directions, and 4 of them were already dead, and the others that were still alive were critically wounded. In fact, one of the most able-bodied of the surviving 12 had been shot in the head and was missing an eye and could barely see out of the other one, and so he's fighting to stay conscious, and he's generally trying to shoot in one direction, but I mean, that's their best guy at this point, to give you a state of how they were doing. But Roy
Roy ran up to this guy, he pulled him down, he gave him a shot of morphine in the arm, and he repositioned him because he couldn't really see, and told him where to shoot his gun. And then under a constant hail of bullets, Roy low-crawled to each of the other living team members and gave them morphine shots, and then began dragging each and every one of them away from the ambush site to this other area where there was better cover, and there was a nearby clearing that he believed a helicopter could land in if the pilot was really daring. On one of Roy's last trips back to the ambush site to get the last few surviving members, he saw two other men that were part of this team that had been totally cut off from the main group. And when Roy had jumped into the jungle and ran in, all his adrenaline had kicked up and he just hadn't done a head count. And so he didn't realize there were two other people over there. And so without any hesitation, he grabbed a gun off of one of the dead enemy soldiers and just began running towards this down two-man team. And as he's running, he's shooting wildly in every direction, trying his best to suppress enemy fire, but it's really doing nothing. He's just dodging bullets as he's running. And right as he got close to the two-man team, a bullet went flying through his thigh, just clean through his thigh, and it didn't slow him down. He got to the two-man team totally unfazed, and he says, okay, get ready to move. He stands back up and he starts shooting again in both directions and tells them to crawl back to the main unit. And so he stands up and continues to shoot in both directions until these two men get back over to the main group. Once they were safely with the group, Roy again ran the gauntlet with this huge gaping hole in his thigh all the way back to the main group. And so now that Roy had a full head count of all of the living members of the downed 12-man team, and he had moved them all to this slightly safer area relatively with better cover and concealment, he threw a smoke grenade into the nearby clearing he had found in hopes that the helo pilot overhead would see the smoke and be willing to come down and land. The pilot that had dropped off Roy had not actually left the area. He had moved away from all the fighting, but he was loitering in case something like this happened. And so he saw the smoke, and without any hesitation, he flew right over, taking rounds the whole time, pinging off the side of his helicopter, and he touched down right in this tiny little clearing. And so as the semi-able-bodied surviving members of this unit began making their way over to the helicopter, Roy began running around a little ways off from the helicopter, picking up rifles off of the dead enemy and shooting back at the enemy, dropping that gun, running over, picking up another one, engaging the enemy over and over again, doing everything he can to try to protect the extract of his men behind him. And once Roy turned around and saw most of the men had made it onto the helicopter, Roy believed it was his chance now to run out and try to collect some of their dead teammates. And so Roy just takes off into the jungle, right into enemy fire. He's got two guns in his hands, and he's running. He's trying to engage the enemy as he's going, and then he comes across the first of his dead teammates, and it happens to be one of his very best friends, a man named Leroy Wright. And so he grabs Leroy and begins trying to haul him back towards the chopper, and as he's moving, Roy gets shot again, this time through his stomach. So he tries to keep himself on his feet, and as he's doing that, a grenade detonates behind him, sending more shrapnel into his body, knocking him unconscious. When he came to, he started looking around, and he could see in the tree line dozens of enemy soldiers running towards him. And so he knew if he tried to bring Leroy back to the chopper, that was a suicide mission. And so he had to leave his friend behind. He jumped up, and with all of these enemy combatants just constantly engaging him, he ran all the way back, zigging and zagging back to the main group. And when he got there, expecting to see the helicopter, he found the helicopter had actually crashed onto the ground and was on fire. It had been shot down while he was unconscious. And so he ran over to the flaming shell of this helicopter, and he saw the pilot had been killed, but some of the men that had climbed on, the men that he had just rescued, they had survived the crash and subsequent explosion. And so Roy just leaps into the burning vehicle and starts throwing these survivors out. But then he leapt back out, he picked up a gun, continued to engage the enemy, and then began picking up these wounded men and dragging them even farther away to another area that was safely away from this crash site, because he knew if he didn't get all these people away from the crash site, pretty soon mortars are going to come raining down on this area, because their enemy is going to want to kill any of the people that are going to try to rescue the people that were on the helicopter. And so Roy finally gets all of the survivors over to this new area, and he's looking around, and he can see there are still hundreds of enemy fighters that are not that far away from them, just constantly engaging them. And Roy's doing his best to grab guns off the ground and shoot the enemy, but there's just too many of them. And he's looking around at his team, and everybody's on the brink of death. And so is Roy. He's just functioning on adrenaline at this point, and he thinks to himself, the only way we can get out of this is if we call in what's called a danger close airstrike. So what you need to understand about how airstrikes work in a combat zone is there's someone called a controller that is on the ground directing the aircraft overhead. They're the ones effectively telling the plane where to shoot. And so a danger close airstrike is when the controller tells the aircraft overhead, I want you to drop a bomb right here, giving them the grid coordinates, but where they're telling them to drop is basically in the same position where the controller is. And you'd only do it if you're being overrun. It's a way to ensure your enemy gets taken out, even if that means taking yourself out. Now, the goal of the controller is not to drop the bomb on themselves or their team. The goal of the controller is to get that airstrike as close as you can to your position without killing you. And so Roy, who's physically wrecked, he's getting shot at, he's got bullet holes all over him, it's totally chaotic. He pulls out his map, he calmly finds his grid coordinates, he calls it into the aircraft overhead, and he calls in a beautiful precision napalm strike that does not affect his team at all. He calls in multiple gun runs. None of them affect his team, despite them all being considered danger close airstrikes. And so Roy just continuously called in attack run after attack run, taking out enemy combatants all around them, completely suppressing the fire. But at some point, the aircraft overhead ran out of fuel and had to leave. And at that point, the surviving enemy combatants, which still numbered in the hundreds, they popped their heads up and they unleashed a hellacious volley of fire in which Roy again got shot clean through the leg. And so now Roy's looking around and he's realizing they're pretty much out of options. They don't have aircraft overhead. Roy's basically out of ammunition and there's no dead guys' guns around for him to grab. All of his team members are basically on the brink of death. And so Roy's thinking to himself, any minute now, we're going to get overrun. And so he crawls to each of his surviving teammates and he gives them one last shot of morphine to at least make their death painless. And then at the 11th hour, another helo comes blazing into the jungle and opens fire on the enemy, pushing them back. Roy is immediately invigorated and motivated because now he sees an opportunity to potentially survive this. And so once again, he grabs his teammates and begins schlepping them over to the helicopter. And after he believed he got the last of them on board, he turned and saw two of his teammates had fallen down farther back in the jungle and the enemy was closing in on them. And so Roy, like always, without any hesitation, just starts running towards them. And as he's just about to reach them, an enemy soldier that had apparently run out of ammunition leapt out of the jungle and smashed Roy on the side of the head with their rifle butt, fracturing his skull. And so Roy falls to the ground and the soldier jumps on top of him and smashes his face, breaking his jaw. And then the soldier turns his rifle around. There's a bayonet on the front side and he begins impaling Roy over and over again. And Roy, like out of a movie, grabbed the rifle, pulled it out of himself, threw the soldier on the ground, jumped up, got on top of him, drew his Bowie knife, and proceeded to kill this soldier. And after he was done with that, he ran over to the two downed men. He grabbed one of them with his left hand. He picked up a rifle with the other. And as he's dragging this guy back to the chopper, he shoots and kills two more enemy combatants. So he finally gets this guy back to the chopper. He runs back, gets the last guy, throws him back in the helicopter. And then finally, Roy is the very last living American to hop in the helicopter, and the helicopter takes off. On the helo ride back, Roy was in very rough shape and had to literally hold his insides inside of his stomach. And so when they finally landed back at base and Roy was hauled off of this helicopter, he wasn't moving, and the doctors and nurses didn't really even know where to start with him. He had so many injuries. He had 37 significant holes in his body from gunshot wounds, from bayonet wounds, from shrapnel. And so they started trying to treat him, but there was no heartbeat, no pulse. And so they declared him dead. Roy's body was moved into a body bag. And as the doctor was zipping it up again, Roy spit in his face because Roy had no other way to communicate. His jaw was so badly broken from that rifle butt, he couldn't move his jaw, and his eyes were sealed shut from all the blood on his face that had dried. And so his only way to communicate was to spit. And so unbelievably, Roy was still alive. And so they took him out of the body bag and they shipped him to Japan for intensive surgery. And then he was transferred to Texas, where he spent a year rehabbing from his severe injuries. Roy was immediately given the Distinguished Service Cross and was put in for the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is the U.S. military's highest award for valor. But the paperwork took a really long time. And so Roy was not actually given the Congressional Medal of Honor until 1981. Of the 12 men that were trapped in that jungle, 8 would survive, all thanks to Roy Benavidez.
Thank you. Thank you. A lot of people call me a hero. I appreciate the title. But the real heroes are the ones that gave their life for this country.
Roy passed away in 1998 as a result of complications from diabetes. He was 63 years old. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please take out all of the like button's trash bags from their trash cans and then proceed to throw various perishable saucy foods inside. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. If there is one war story that everybody needs to hear at least once, it is the crazy story of how this small group of Russian soldiers during World War I defended Auschwitz Fortress in Poland. It is both absolutely horrific and utterly inspiring. And I guarantee you it's nothing like any other war story you've ever heard. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house, take all their fresh eggs out of the fridge, hard boil them, and then put them back. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of August 3rd, 1915, during World War I, a 21-year-old Russian soldier named Vladimir Kotlinsky looked out from behind the huge stone walls of Auschwitz Fortress in Poland. Out in front of him, he saw the same landscape he had been looking at for the last 6 months that he had been stationed at this fortress. It was a big, swampy forest that surrounded them on all sides. Additionally, in this swampy forest around them on all sides were dozens and dozens of trenches. Trenches are long, deep pits that soldiers will dig to both hide inside of when they're being attacked, and then also to launch their own attacks out of from behind their dirt walls. And these trenches that zigged and zagged all around Auschwitz Fortress were created by and now occupied by 7,000 German soldiers. And during World War I, the Russians were fighting the Germans. The Germans really wanted to take Auschwitz Fortress from the Russians. It was in a great strategic position with a railway passing right through it. There was also a river nearby and a main road, meaning whoever owned this fortress was greatly aided in moving critical wartime supplies and troops in a very hotly contested area. But despite the repeated attempts by these 7,000 Germans to take over Auschwitz Fortress over the past 6 months, they had all been repelled by Vladimir and the puny 900-man Russian force inside of the fortress. And so, by that morning, August 3rd, 1915, as Vladimir is looking out from the battlements over the trenches in the marsh down below, it was like both the Russians and the Germans had reached a sort of stalemate, where neither side was trying to attack the other, and neither side was leaving. They were just kind of staying put and doing nothing. In fact, over the last few weeks, there had been so little action from either side that the Russian soldiers inside the fortress got so bored, they began sneaking out the side door of the fortress to try to catch fish with their bare hands in the nearby river. But this morning, as Vladimir stood atop the wall, he noticed something strange happening in one of the trenches that was located closest to the fortress. It was still several hundred feet away, but he could see clearly down into this trench. And what he saw was there was this cluster of high-ranking German officers that were kind of huddled together, and they kept looking down at the ground at something inside of the trench that Vladimir couldn't see, and then they would look up at the sky and kind of wave their hands around, and then they'd look back down at the ground below them. Now, Vladimir had no idea what they were doing. I mean, again, he could not see what they were looking at in the trench, and when he looked up into the sky where they seemed to be creepy looking. It just looked like a regular blue sky. But whatever they were doing, it was making Vladimir feel nervous. Vladimir was a young junior officer, which meant he was in charge of other soldiers, but because he was so new, he lacked experience and credibility, and so really wasn't considered a serious leader within the army. And so Vladimir, as he's watching this strange behavior, was concerned that if he left now and told his superiors that he was worried about the Germans because they were looking at the sky funny and looking at the ground funny, that it would make him look like he was being paranoid and not a good leader. And so ultimately, Vladimir just looked at this cluster inside of the trench and decided, you know what, they're not shooting at us, there's no attack happening, so whatever they're doing, it can't be that big of a deal. And lately, no one's done anything, so why would that change now? And so Vladimir left the walls of Auschwitz Fortress and went down below to hang out with his friends. 3 days later, at 4 in the morning, the Russian soldiers who were up along the Auschwitz Fortress walls keeping watch that night noticed something strange out in the darkness near where the Germans were. When they looked out, they saw that the dark night air almost looked kind of blurry or wavy, kind of like if you were looking at air coming off of hot pavement on a sunny day, it would look kind of blurry. That's what the night sky looked like to them. But of course, it couldn't be because of heat and sun, because it's the morning, it's cold, it's dark outside. And so as these Russians are looking out, not sure what to make of this blurry air, they began calling up more Russians to go have a look and figure out what this was. And over the next couple of minutes, as the Russians looked out from behind the walls at this air, they realized what it was. It was this huge grayish green cloud that was as wide as the fortress was, and the wind was blowing it in their direction. Now, the Russian soldiers had no idea what this was, and so they just kind of stood there watching it in stunned silence. And as they watched, they saw as the cloud would touch any vegetation like leaves on trees or the high grass in the marsh, it would all turn black and shrivel up. And then the soldiers began hearing a soft thump, 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 thump out in the darkness. And it was the sound of birds dying and falling to the ground that were inside of this cloud. At this point, the Russians began to panic and they began to run to sound the alarm to get the other soldiers up to prepare for an attack. But as they did, they began to smell this very harsh chemical smell coming into the fortress. And then before long, all the Russians could hear was the sound of their comrades coughing. It would turn out that strange behavior that Vladimir saw 3 days earlier of the German officers huddled together looking at the sky and then looking down at the ground and then back at the sky again, what they were doing was preparing for a chemical attack on Auschwitz Fortress. On the ground, out of sight of Vladimir, were canisters containing the poisonous gas, and when the officers would look up and put their hands up, they were gauging if the wind was strong enough and in the right direction to launch the attack. Now, 3 days ago, the wind had not been in their favor, but this morning at 4 a.m. on August 6th, 1915, the wind had been in their favor, and they had released the gas. And this gas was quite possibly the worst gas you could ever come up against on the battlefield. It was a combination of chlorine gas and bromine gas. On their own, chlorine and bromine are very toxic and can kill you. But when you mix those two gases, it becomes exponentially more dangerous. The gas mixture binds to moisture and then turns the moisture into hydrochloric acid. Meaning, if a person who did not have a gas mask on came in contact with this poisonous gas, when they inhaled it, it would literally fill their lungs with acid, which would dissolve them from the inside out. And then also, the gas would get into their eyes and into their nose, and the acid there would burrow holes into their skull. And once you've come in contact with this gas, there's nothing anybody can do to save you. You're gonna die, except it's gonna take a really, really long time. You don't just immediately dissolve. It's this long, drawn-out, excruciatingly painful process. By this point in World War I, chemical warfare was really not being used by anybody, and so as a result, the Russian army did not outfit their soldiers with gas masks. The German army did, and they knew the Russian army did not. So, as this horrific poisonous gas began permeating every square inch of Auschwitz Fortress, all of these Russian soldiers had nothing they could do to protect themselves from this gas. And so right away, soldiers began bleeding from their eyes and their mouths and their ears, and they literally began coughing up chunks of their lung. And so very quickly, the Russians inside the fortress understood they were being poisoned. And so these soldiers that were not as affected, at least not right away, by this gas, quickly began ripping off their shirts, dunking them in water, and wrapping them around their heads to try to limit how much they breathed in of this chemical. But it really didn't do much to stop the chemical. In fact, these makeshift gas masks might have made it worse because the gas would have bound to the moisture on the shirt. And so the Russians were totally doomed. They were surrounded on all sides outside the walls by their enemy, and then inside the fortress was this gas, and there was no ventilation in the fortress, and so there was nowhere to go. They couldn't escape death no matter where they went. And so Vladimir, he was one of the guys that was still on his feet inside of the fortress, and he stumbled over to this narrow window on the side of the fortress walls, and he looked out and he saw all these Germans running towards them, firing their machine guns, artillery's being fired. I mean, he knows they are moments away from the Germans breaching the fortress door, coming inside, and killing every last one of them. But Vladimir's reaction to this was not being scared or being sad. Instead, he suddenly felt incredibly motivated. If they're going to come in here and kill us, then we're going to make it as hard as humanly possible first. Vladimir had a reputation for being totally fearless. Over the past 6 months that they had been under siege from the German army out in their trenches, anytime fighting broke out, Vladimir was always the first to run up and be right on the front line of fighting, and then several times when his comrades had been shot or wounded, Vladimir would run out into the line of fire to save the fallen soldiers. It was like Vladimir lacked any instinct for self-preservation. And so as the Germans continued their run towards the fortress, artillery shells are hitting the walls, there's constant gunfire, and Vladimir, he leaves his window and he marches back over to the open courtyard inside of this fortress where the 100 or so other still living Russian soldiers were. I mean, they're all gonna die. They've been totally poisoned by this gas, and it's just a matter of time now, but they're still on their feet, and Vladimir walks over to them, and even though, again, he's pretty junior, he stands up and he says to them, "This is our moment. We are all going to die, but what we do right now will define us." And the way Vladimir said it, he got those 100 soldiers who were on death's door to be so motivated so quickly that they rallied to him. And so as these men are literally bleeding out of their eyes, their mouths, they're coughing up pieces of their lung, Vladimir explained the plan. And then moments later, with Vladimir in the front, this gaggle of soon-to-die Russian soldiers charged towards the gates, opened the fortress, and began running out towards the Germans, screaming with their bayonets lowered. Now, the Germans on the outside fully expected that this chemical attack would kill all of the Russians, that taking Auschwitz Fortress would be super routine because when they walked in, everybody would be dead. And so suddenly to have the fortress open and have these men that are covered in bloody rags and they're puking up pieces of their organs and they're stumbling forward like zombies with bayonets out, screaming like banshees, it scared the living out of the Germans. In fact, they were so quickly terrified by what they saw, they literally dropped their guns, turned, and began running back towards their trenches. And as they did, Vladimir and his dead man army began picking off the Germans one by one. And then after Vladimir and the dead man army ran out of ammunition, they just continued staggering forward directly into the thousands of Germans in front of them and began picking up dead German weapons and firing them. And then when they got up to the trenches where these retreating Germans had been so scared they had run into their own barbed wire, and so there's all these retreating Germans stuck on the barbed wire, the Russians just began bayoneting all these men that were stuck. And so at some point, as Vladimir is doing this, a German soldier ran up to him and bayoneted Vladimir right in the stomach. He ran him all the way through until the barrel of the gun was right up against his stomach. And Vladimir apparently looked down at this bayonet, knew he had been completely run through, and he looked up at the German who had just stabbed him, who's still holding the gun, and Vladimir spit blood and lung tissue all over this German's face, and then just began screaming directly at this guy. And so the German was so scared, he just dropped the gun, turned, tried to run, and then Vladimir was back on his gun with the bayonet still in his stomach, shooting at the Germans. The Germans were so completely caught off guard and terrified by Vladimir's dead man army counterattack that even though they outnumbered the Russians 70-1, they failed to take Auschwitz fortress. The main reason for that was the Germans who had escaped the counterattack and made it back to their trenches. They told the other German soldiers that the Russians had turned into zombies, literally, that they were undead, and so attacking them was pointless. They're already dead. And the Germans were so scared, they refused to leave their trenches again. Once the Russians could tell they had successfully forced a retreat by the German army, Vladimir, who was still alive at this point with a gun still stuck in his gut from the bayonet, he called out to the rest of his soldiers to retreat back to the fortress. And so this handful of Russian soldiers who were about to die, they hobbled their way back inside of their fortress, and then Vladimir gave his final command: destroy the fortress. If we can't have it, nobody can. Every single Russian soldier that came in contact with that poisonous gas died, including Vladimir. When the Germans did eventually take Auschwitz fortress at a later date, when again, all of the Russians were dead, when the Germans went inside, they realized the fortress had been destroyed and it was no longer strategically valuable. Vladimir would be awarded posthumously Russia's highest military honor. His actions and the actions of the other dying soldiers that fought alongside him are remembered today in stories, songs, and statues all across Russia. $250,000. That's how much you all contributed to Dave Hartsock's GoFundMe page after we covered his story on our YouTube channel. Dave is the heroic skydiver who sacrificed his body to save his student. Now, because of that, Dave is totally paralyzed and fully dependent on his mother to take care of him. I spoke to Dave after all this money came in, and to say he's happy is such an understatement. I mean, this literally changed his life, and it's because of you. But as awesome as that is, our work is not done. There are other very deserving people that really could use our help. And one group in particular that really needs attention are the victims of violent crime as well as their families. And that is where the MrBallen Foundation comes into play. Within days of the Uvalde Elementary School shooting, the MrBallen Foundation sent $150,000 to support victims and their families. And going forward, we will continue to support them as long as they need support. This year, in addition to all the donations we expect to receive, our company, Ballen Studios, which is a separate entity, is going to be giving $1 million to the MrBallen Foundation, and all of it will go to the cause. We are not taking any money for profit in MrBallen Foundation. Truly, 100% of donations that go into that foundation go to the cause. And if you don't know this, that is very rare for most charities. Usually, you got to pull money to pay for the organization. Not for us. It is 100%. You give money to the MrBallen Foundation, it goes right out the door to victims of violent crime and their families. So, if you want to join forces with me and the MrBallen Foundation and genuinely make a difference in the lives of people that so desperately need our help, go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved at the top of the page. Once there, consider becoming a monthly donor to the Honor Them Society. These supporters not only contribute to the cause, but also they get free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Again, go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to see how you can partner up with me and the MrBallen Foundation. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the Like Button's house and remove all of their fresh eggs from their fridge, hard boil them, and then put them back. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we upload the remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, the podcast is just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Espanol. We also put out near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those channels are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. To check out our merch, to join our Discord server, or just see what things are going on within our studio, go to our brand new website, ballenstudios.com. So, whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.